Chapter 679. The changing of the seasons went on unhurriedly around the port of Immerse. The increasingly dense forest began to cover the green hills, and the excavation work outside the port could not completely cover up the news. Since the Bugit craftsman left, the rumors about the Azure Lance still spread. What an eventful time. Wood rubbed his eyebrows and stared at a page of letter on the mahogany table. The paper was snow-white and came from the eastern part of Cruz, adjacent to the forest border of the four-leaf clover. There was still a faint burnt smell in the corner of the letter, which was the unique trace of the magic imprint left by the flame magic. Before this imprint was erased, it should have been 4 pairs of eagles with their wings spread, representing the Holy Cathedral of Fire, or rather, the highest level of confidential documents in the Cruz Empire. He looked up and sat at the mahogany table for a while, staring at the opposite wall under his thick eyebrows. For a moment, his eyes seemed a little illusory. Then the former Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral suddenly ignited a golden flame in his hand. He shook his hand gently, and the charred letter suddenly turned into ashes. Wood carefully tidied up the embers on the table, then straightened up and tidied up his golden priest robe. The news in the secret letter confirmed the news that had been circulating in the port in recent days, but in fact, he had already learned all the relevant information from the young Count Tonagel. The people of Erewhon did not intend to hide it from him, or at least did not intend to cover up the apparent fact: the Azure Lance did exist in Immerse. But it was meaningless because the Bugit people had already taken it away. Wood's expression was uncertain, and his mind was repeatedly trying to figure out the information contained in this incident. He didn't know if it was the decisiveness of the little princess of Erewhon, or the shrewdness of the young count, but the benefits they had exchanged with the Azure Lance from the Bugit people were very obvious. He couldn't help but look back and cast his gaze out of the window. Outside the window was the light red undulating roof of the port of Immerse. Emerald green vines hung down from the glass, splitting the sunlight sprinkled on the mahogany table into strange shapes. This was really a vibrant city, but now it no longer belonged to the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Wood did not feel anything about this matter. The temple had made a mistake and should pay the price for it. The key was that at least this kingdom still believed in the way of the golden flames, and their people did not deviate from their reverence for the Holy Cathedral of Fire. As for secular interests, Wood had never been too concerned. However, what really worried him was the inner circle of the Holy Sanctum. No, it should be said that the upper echelons of the empire coveted the Azure Lance. Greed could blind a person's heart, and this was especially true for the nobles. Even he himself had suffered greatly from it. However, judging from the words in the letter, His Majesty the Emperor himself should also be interested. After all, it was the Azure Lance, the most famous weapon in the Pale poem. At this level, it was no longer something he could change. In the past, he might have been able to come up with some solutions when he was the Archbishop, but now it was not something he could worry about. He could only hope that the people in power within the Holy Cathedral of Fire could be more rational and see the true teachings of the Flame King. He sighed, took off the Archbishop's square hat and put it on his head, then opened the door. The knight loyal to the Holy Sanctum had already been waiting outside. His deputy was no longer the former Friar Get. Since he became the liaison between the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the Erewhon royal family, his deputy had been replaced by a more shrewd officer. That person must have come from the core diplomatic agency of the Empire. Wood only had to look at his clothes and habits to know the details at a glance. This person was called Peter, and he was extremely tactful. When he saw Wood, he immediately bowed his head deeply, revealing his shiny bald head, and respectfully asked, "Lord Archbishop, is it about the Holy Sword Oderfice?" Wood glanced at him, as if he wanted to see through this guy, and then replied lightly, "This is a secret of the Holy Sanctum. If necessary, I will tell you." "I understand," Peter replied with a smile. Wood looked back. The fragment of the Holy Sword Oderfice that Williams lost in the Battle of Immerse was not important. The Holy Sanctum had also agreed to exchange a new frigate with Brando for the fragment of the Holy Sword, but the key was the will and soul of the Holy Sword. The identity of Count Tonagel was very special. He even had the shadow of the Silver Elves and the dragons behind him, which made the Holy Sanctum's higher-ups feel very troubled. What's more, the other party did not seem to have any intention of joining the Empire, so the opinions of the higher-ups were not unified. On one hand, they believed that they should follow the choice of the Flame King, while on the other hand, their opinions were much stronger. This was another troublesome matter. Too many years of being high and mighty had made the Holy Sanctum of Fire somewhat arrogant and even indifferent to things outside. Some of the elders even had thoughts of assassination. Not to mention how ridiculous it was to assassinate a noble under the rule of the Holy Sanctum of Fire. What really made Wood angry was that these people seemed to have forgotten the teachings of the sages. Whether it was the Empire or the truth, it would not have been a problem for the Holy Sanctum of Fire 100 years ago. Since Cruz's reform, although the unity of the Empire had strengthened day by day, the weight of the royal power had increased day by day, and it had begun to threaten the foundation of Cruz's existence. The funny thing was that some people had not realized this problem at all. Wood was still going to meet the representatives of the northern nobles who were still in the port of Ampere Seal today. Although the things under the table were getting more and more onerous, the war was still the top priority for the affairs left in Erewhon. The war against the Golden Mane Toquinin. Wood did not know if the eldest son of the king was fully prepared. Although he made a solemn vow when he made the promise, the Cipher family had already suffered a great loss in this war. What's more, as a puppet, it was still unknown how much prestige he could have. The Holy Sanctum would never invest much energy in a bet that was bound to fail. In this regard, Wood could only hope that the eldest son of the king would also understand this point. Fortunately, he was a smart guy, and presumably would not be too naive. He walked out of the door with his deputy, but it was at this time that a servant came to him and bowed, saying, "Lord Archbishop, there are special visitors." Special visitors? Wood stopped. The bald Peter had already stepped forward and wanted to drive them away. Can't you see that the Lord Archbishop has something important to do? If there are any visitors, as long as they are not from the Empire, just let them wait a moment. Wood interrupted him and reached out to stop the guy. Are they guests from the Empire? Peter froze for a moment. Yes, the servant replied deferentially. Let them wait a moment, I'll be right there. Wood thought for a moment and replied with a frown. But before he could finish his words, a serious woman's voice rang out, "There's no need, Archbishop Wood. You know my habits. We are already here." Wood heard this voice and was slightly startled. He raised his head. Sure enough, he saw the woman with a prominent reputation in the Empire. She actually came. Unlike the sunny area of Ampere Seal, after crossing the vast Frauda forest in the north and entering Petal Sun, the weather in the countryside became rainy and rainy. The heavy rain in the past few days had caused the Mauge River to surge, and the roads around Mageddon had become muddy and difficult to walk on. In the torrential rain, a black, ghost-like carriage jolted through the woods. A corner of the window curtain was lifted, and in the pitch-black carriage, an eye that was faintly white like a dead fish's eye stared motionlessly at the shadowy scenery outside the window. The gloomy clouds twisted into a ball over the forest like a shroud. Although it was only noon, the sky was dim. What is the commander of the Azure Skies doing in Ampere Seal? Declaring war on the Erewhon people? A hoarse voice asked, and then he sneered, as if he thought this joke was very funny. The sneer in the carriage was chilling. After a while, another voice said, "I'm afraid it's for the war in the north. If that's what you think, you're not far from the gallows. The Cruz people don't need to be distracted by a small Toquinin. They suffered a great loss in the Battle of Ampere Seal, and they don't want to give the Bugas any more leverage." The third person to speak had a calm, serious, and dignified voice. As soon as he spoke, the others fell silent. The Holy Cathedral of Fire lost both face and power in Ampere Seal. On the surface, they didn't gain anything from us, but in fact, the final winner was neither us nor them. The voice paused for a moment. Erwin has a wise princess. Duke, someone finally dared to speak up. Are you saying that we have attracted the attention of the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Very likely. It's impossible that the cruise people didn't notice anything wrong. Do you really think you can do it flawlessly? The dignified voice replied. Then what should we do? No one answered. The carriage was silent for a moment, and only the creaking of the carriage could be heard. After a while, the hoarse voice said, as long as we find a way to delay, so that's why we're here. The dignified voice replied. At this time, the carriage finally stopped in the middle of its journey, and a dark green castle appeared in front of them in the rain. The soldiers on the battlements shouted, but it was difficult for their voices to pass through the rain. At this time, the door of the carriage finally opened, and a swordsman in a cloak jumped down. The swordsman looked up, and the unshaven face under the hood looked like a wreck or a wandering knight from the north, but if Brando was here, he would have recognized his name. The eagle swordsman, Devard. Hurry up and open the city gates, this is your count's most distinguished guest, he shouted. Who are you? The soldiers on the battlements questioned. We are the allies he wants to see the most. Go tell him, if he doesn't want to be hanged by the princess, immediately open the gate and let us in. Devard replied arrogantly. This question and answer was extremely rude, but just as the soldiers were about to flare up, the eagle swordsman threw an item far away on the battlements. He watched as the item drew a beautiful parabola in the rain and fell into the city, then shouted, Take this to Count Radner, he will understand. Go, idiot. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 680. Brando, do you want me to ask the Roman to? No, no need, Freya. I'm used to it. Let her be, she knows what she's doing. By the way, help me keep an eye on her and don't let her come crying to me with a red forehead. The background of this conversation was the verdant path of the Gross Forest. A long line of carriages passed through the scattered spots of light. The knight in gold and red battle robes moved in an orderly manner, except for one. The merchant lady was wearing a shiny armor and holding the azure lance. She yelled and ran around the carriages without a care for her image. This was the second time she had done this week. Fortunately, the knight was already familiar with this cute countess. Anyway, as long as they stayed far away, at least they would not be knocked over. No matter how muddle-headed the merchant lady was, she would not hit the carriage, right? Freya looked back and could not help but sigh slightly. She originally thought that after she went to the Royal Knight Academy, Brando could at least restrain the Roman a little. But obviously, it was just wishful thinking. At least until now, no one had succeeded in restraining this young lady. She looked at Brando and nodded to him. Then, she let down the curtain and rode her horse to Scarlet's side. The mercenary lady looked at the scenery around her with some familiarity. Unlike Freya, the south was as close to her as home. Scarlet. Miss Freya. Scarlet looked back and answered with some respect. Scarlet, I've told you many times, you can just call me Freya. I'm not a noble. Before I became a knight, I was just like you, from the countryside in the south. Freya frowned. Scarlet was a little embarrassed. Freya, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have given the azure lance to the Roman lady. I didn't expect her to be so. She suddenly felt a little rude, but she couldn't find a better adjective to describe the Roman's current state. Freya saw her embarrassment and comforted her. All right, she's not a rich girl. Forget it. She's just like that. She sighed weakly. When I was with her when I was young, I really admire myself for being able to live until now. But she's actually a very good Roman person. She's just a little childish. Scarlet looked over and couldn't help but deeply agree. However, when she turned her head back, her gaze couldn't help but fall in the direction of the carriage. Brando put down the curtains. After nearly a month of observation, he could basically confirm the state of the Holy Lance of Heaven. The firmament in Scarlet's hand was clearly not the complete form of the legendary Holy Spear that could strike down stars. There were multiple seals on the Holy Spear, and this was one of the possibilities that he had long thought of. What Brando didn't know was that Ovina had purposely placed these seals so that Scarlet could successfully control the firmament, or that someone had left these seals on the Holy Spear in the first place. But there was no doubt that even under the heavy seals, the Holy Lance of Heaven lived up to its name as a divine artifact. Its attack power was more than twice that of Halran Gaia, and its accompanying skills were even more terrifying. Most importantly, as a divine artifact, the firmament also had a special divine realm. The terrifying, invincible fate was so powerful that even Brando had never seen it before. However, Brando did not reveal this secret. For one thing, he really couldn't find a good way to explain the fact that he could directly see the attributes of the equipment. In Wond, this was the job of high-level astrologers and alchemists, and they also had to go through many experiments before they could finally determine the purpose and usage of a magical equipment. On the other hand, for the current heroine, the weaker the azure lance, the better, and the lower the profile of its existence, the better. The merchant lady was messing around with the azure lance, and that was actually what he wanted. Anyway, everyone knew her temperament. If she took it out so blatantly, it would make people less suspicious that it was the real thing. Who would use the azure lance as a toy? Perhaps even William wouldn't dare to do so. However, Brando had been feeling a little uneasy recently. He had a faint suspicion that Ovina would kill him directly when she reappeared in the future. He turned his head anxiously and his gaze fell on the siblings opposite him. To be exact, it was the first in line to the throne of the Kingdom of Erwin and his sister, the half-elf Princess Royal. It had been almost a month since the Holy Lance of Heaven recognized Scarlet as its master. The weather south of Ampere Seal was in fact getting hotter by the day. Since the Battle of Ampere Seal, every overt and covert activity carried out by the Princess forces in the port had gone smoothly. However, the final destination of the Azure Lance was somewhat unexpected. The Bugis suddenly decided not to take the Azure Lance away. According to William's original words, they thought that this legendary holy relic might be more suitable to stay in Erewhon. However, Tanya also mentioned that the Bugis would probably send 1 or 2 wizards to the kingdom to study the power of the Azure Lance. Although he did not understand the Bugis thoughts, these were afterthoughts for Brando. Time was tight, and he was unlikely to have new envoys from Ampere Seal and other wizards arrive. After seeing William off, he left the port directly with the princess, passing by the Royal Knight Academy, and went straight to Tonajol. The princess was eager to see her best friend, Magadol, and he himself had to start preparing for the future of Erewhon. After a week of travel, the carriage finally approached the Glass River. Here, for Brando, it was basically the same as returning home. During this half a day, he had met several old members of the Red Bronze Dragon mercenary group, and Sue was finally able to meet her father, the Red Bronze Dragon Redo. It was the first time Brando saw the strong bar owner's daughter cry. The meeting between Carglass and his father was naturally a different scene. Since Brando was officially recognized, Sir Maxen was naturally exempted from the embarrassment of being imprisoned. However, this old-fashioned noble obviously did not necessarily agree with his precious son's approach, and scolded the first commander of the White Lion Legion under Brando. This naturally became the joke of the group of young people from Tonajol. But in any case, being able to return home was still a matter of excitement for everyone. However, no one would forget those heroic souls that would forever stay in Ampere Seal. Brando silently thought about these trivial matters until the princess in front of him softly opened her mouth. The half-elf girl raised her head and looked at the young man opposite her. The mottled sunlight outside the curtains fell on her face, and that beautiful face of hers was divided into different shades of shadow. It was as if she was wearing a layer of natural veil, adding a sense of mystery out of nowhere. However, Princess Griffin's expression was very calm. She thought for a moment before quietly asking, "Mr. Brando, the royal spies have news that Count Randner seems to have met with a wreck, just as you guessed. In order to fight against us, they will form an alliance. Although Duke Anthony and the Highland Knight have agreed to send troops to fight, I'm still a little worried." "Worried about what?" "I'm worried about a wreck, Mr. Brando. My father is very familiar with him. The Erech family has been operating in the Highlands for generations under their rule for the sake of overthrowing the kingdom. And today's Grand Duke Erech is undoubtedly the most cunning of all the heirs of their family." Her Royal Highness replied softly, "Archbishop Wood told me that he has evidence to prove that Erech also colluded with All for One, but in the entire war, he only sent the eagle swordsman Devard to show his face at the end. As soon as the war ended, he hurriedly left Ampere Seal before the Holy Cathedral caught him, but he did not return to his own territory. Instead, he went to Magidon and formed an alliance with Count Randner. He never fights a battle that he is not sure of, so I suspect that he must have some conspiracy." Brando nodded. In fact, this was also something that bothered him. In fact, before the princess received the news, Wood had already sent a letter to tell Erech the cause and effect of the day of his escape, but he keenly felt that the Holy Cathedral seemed to have concealed some key information. The most important point was that Brando knew that a knight regiment from Cruz had secretly entered Erewhon, but he didn't know which regiment it belonged to. This knight regiment was obviously not here to deal with him, and naturally, it would not deal with the eldest son of the king in the north. So the remaining possibility could only be pointed to Erech. But what did Erech do to deserve such attention from the Holy Cathedral? Even if he colluded with the cultists, it was just a joke. To be honest, how many nobles in Erewhon did not collude with the cultists? Although Grand Duke Erech's direct collusion with All for One was a minority, the great nobles more or less raised some shady thieves. If the Holy Cathedral wanted to use this excuse to dodge, Brando really didn't even have the mood to listen. Erech must have some conspiracy, but the question was what the conspiracy was. Radner's primary target was definitely him and the princess, and a war between the two sides was inevitable. Although the Holy Cathedral of Fire was looking for trouble with Erech, it didn't necessarily mean that he and the princess would do the same. Cruz's people suffered a big loss in Ampere Seal, and they might take the opportunity to retaliate. And the core of the problem was that the situation in the north and south had stabilized, so the Holy Cathedral of Fire might not be happy to see the princess quickly unify the south. Besides, Erewhon's letter also mentioned that the upper echelons of the empire coveted the azure lance. Once it was confirmed that this holy relic was still in Erewhon, it could be a huge problem. This was the real problem. He thought about it and felt that the most important thing now was to get rid of the alliance between Erech and Radner. However, it was obviously not realistic to remove the power of the Erech family in the Erech Highlands in a short time. On the contrary, Count Radner himself was the weak link in this evil alliance. However, he and the princess alone were not enough. P.S. The warlord is here again. It's the third night watch again, you know. Finally, Nico-chan, I like you too. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 681. The sound of the brass doorknob turning seemed to pierce through the dark emptiness and solitude. Princess Griffin opened the wooden door with a creak and walked out of the room. Her silver curly hair set off her elf-like slender face. Her eyes were still a little red, but she had already regained her usual cold expression. Magidal, she, has been sleeping all this time. Yes, it's no different from being dead. Although her basic physiological functions are still maintained, that's just on the surface. A self-conscious girl's voice answered before Brando could reply. Looking towards the direction of the voice, Princess Alah's curly hair shone like gold in the dark. She held a red wild fruit and took a bite. The juice flowed down the corner of her mouth and the curve of her chin. But the little female dragon did not care. Instead, she stared at Brando and Princess Griffin with her golden cat eyes. In fact, you can say that the one lying on the bed is just a shell that has lost its soul. According to the words of you humans, this description is very apartment. If she was a human, she would have died long ago. Her Royal Highness is asking me, Allahs. Brando replied with a straight face. Ever since this little female dragon came to his territory alone, she had been using his name and the deterrence of the dragon clan to eat and drink until today. The only praiseworthy thing she did was to check on Magadal's condition. But that was also driven by her curiosity. And it was obvious that even though she had been traveling in human society for a long time, she had not learned how to be tactful when talking to people. If she's asking me, I won't answer. What do you take me for, Brando? Allahs narrowed her eyes dangerously. But with the height of a 13-year-old girl, she was hardly intimidating. Stop arguing, it's nothing. The princess interrupted them. She did not want Brando to provoke the dragon clan because of her. She walked forward and asked quietly, My lord, about the alliance between Erech and Radner, do you have any thoughts? Allahs snorted coldly. Brando was startled. He thought that Princess Griffin would ask him about the nun princess, but she brought it up again. He had already thought about this problem on the carriage. The most suitable way to deal with Count Radner was to kill him. After all, things were different now. Unlike when he first came to Tonajol, Count Radner had overwhelming power. In terms of high-end combat power, even Duke Erech and Count Radner together might not be his match. Duke Erech had the Eagle Swordsman and Silver Knight, as well as a few famous swordsmen and some retainers, while Radner only had 7 or 8 gold-rank lackeys. Even if Radner did not die in Ampere Seal, Brando could easily take care of them. After all, this was wound, and personal strength accounted for a considerable proportion of the war. In the history of Wound, most of the higher-ups of the several legions were outstanding people, and there was no lack of outstanding people like his grandfather, Darius. The only problem was that the calculations in war were always mutual. If he schemed against the other party here, Duke Erech might beat him at his own game. The strength he showed in the Battle of Ampere Seal was already shocking. Although most people thought that Williams died under the gunfire of Erwin's First Fleet, just the battle with Eagle Devard and the battle against the Titans was enough to make people pay attention to him, the rising star of Erwin. The name of Count Tonajol had long been spread throughout Erwin, and even among the higher-ups of Cruz, he was familiar with it. Whether it was in the tundra of the north or the countryside of the south, everyone knew that Erwin had another sword saint. He was even the descendant of Darius. Such news naturally could not escape Duke Erech's eyes and ears, not to mention that the old fox had personally experienced the war that day. Since he dared to show up in public despite knowing the disparity in strength, he was either too arrogant, or he had other plans. Brando would rather believe that it was the latter. Therefore, it was best to prepare for a conventional war in addition to the strategy of beheading the leader. However, the territory of Erech was vast, and there were many mountains in Radner's territory. Without considering the participation of Cruz, it would take a lot of time to fight in both places. Count Radner had been at war with Duke Vero for many years, and maintained a large number of private soldiers in his territory. As for Duke Erech, he had been planning for a long time, and most of his subordinates were elite soldiers. On the other hand, other than the First Royal Fleet that was still resting in Ampere Seal, the princess could only rely on Frada's army and the Southern Legion. In addition, she also had the support promised by Duke Anthony and the Highland Knight. However, the Southern Legion had not received any supplies for a long time, and most of their structures were incomplete. Duke Anthony's army had also suffered heavy losses in the war in Ampere Seal, so the only ones that could participate in the war were Frada's nobles' army and the Highland Knights' reinforcements. In addition, Tonajol's pitiful little military strength. These miscellaneous troops together could not form an absolute advantage over Duke Erek and Count Ranner's forces. Even if they did not consider Erek's schemes, it would probably be a long and arduous task to conquer Ranner and Count Ranner. The problem was that Brando was very clear that Erwin did not have the time to engage in such a long and drawn-out war. He could only look for other reinforcements. The best choice was naturally Duke Vero, who had a feud with Count Ranner for generations. Princess Griffin silently listened to Brando's thoughts. When the sunlight from outside the courtyard shone on her face through the arched door, the half-elf girl stopped and turned around. I understand. The war with Count Ranner will be handed over to you, Mr. Brando. Frada's army will also be under Tonagel's command. Brando suddenly froze. Your Highness. Of course, he understood the meaning behind this sentence, but he did not seem to react for a moment. He subconsciously stopped and looked at the princess. The sun afternoon seemed to have just flooded the wild grape shelves in the courtyard, and the lush green color passed through the last section of the corridor before the arched door and imprinted on the princess' long dress. There seemed to be a moment of silence, and not a single sound could be heard. Princess Griffin looked at him, and there was only a very calm color in her silver eyes. There's no need to say any more. I believe in you, Mr. Brando. But Brando's mouth was a little dry. Although Princess Griffin had handed over the keystone to him that day in Ampere Seal, it was different from before. Now that Princess Griffin had handed over almost all of her forces to him, it seemed a little indulgent. This did not seem like the behavior of a clear-headed politician. However, Princess Griffin did not seem to want to give him a chance to speak. She lowered her eyelids, blinked her thick eyelashes slightly, and continued quietly. There's one more thing. Brendel heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately, Alaz, the little female dragon, had already walked away in boredom. Otherwise, she would have laughed at him for making a fool of himself. Magadol, she, is my dear friend. I understand, she became like this because of me. No matter what, as long as there's a glimmer of hope, I hope you can save her. You're the only one by my side who has such an ability. So, can you promise me that? Brando did not look at the expression on Princess Griffin's face, but he could hear the rare weakness in her voice. He did not say much, and only nodded. In fact, even if Princess Griffin did not mention it, he would have thought of a way to save Magadol. After fighting side by side, they were considered companions. This was what Senior Griffin had said. I understand. He replied. Princess Griffin raised her head, looked at him carefully, and then took 2 steps forward. She reached out a hand and pressed on his nobleman's scarf, and smiled with some relief. Thank you, my knight. You have never disappointed me. Then she stepped back, took one last look at him, and walked down the stairs. In the blink of an eye, she disappeared from the courtyard, leaving Brando standing alone in a daze under the arched door. Princess Griffin seems to have a good impression of you, Brando. Until a crisp voice interrupted his thoughts. Brando's eyebrows twitched slightly. He turned around and saw a familiar face. Roman was wearing her thick merchant's clothes. She crossed her arms and stood a little behind him, curiously looking at the direction Griffin disappeared in. He didn't know when this guy had arrived. Brando looked at her face full of question marks, and could not help but ask a little unhappily, so, you don't know how to be jealous at all? A little. Brando stared at her. Is my answer wrong, Brando? Roman looked at him and shrunk her neck. Brando sighed and reached out his hand. Give me your hand. Why? This is an order. Oh, Romaine thought for a moment, and wiped her hand on her coat, and then put her hand in his palm. Brando felt the slightly cold temperature, and could not help but look at the young lady, and his heart softened. Have you been out on the streets? Not yet, fella did not let me go out. If I knew this would happen, I would not have asked Scarlet to borrow that gun. It's too much, I already returned it to her. Roman was unhappy. I'll accompany you for a walk. Really? Romaine asked in surprise. Of course. Then. Brendel, can you really wake up that Princess Highness? It sounds like a night story, a prince and a princess. When she wakes up, will she marry you, Brando? This is not something you need to worry about. Brando replied unhappily. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 682. Once the war was put on the agenda, the preparations were like a wild horse that had escaped its reins and galloped forward. Tonajul had entered a state of readiness early on, and the White Lion infantry had begun to fill up the ranks. Ever since Medisha returned to her territory, the training of the wind archers had also been scheduled. Under the princess' instructions, the nobles that bordered Tonajul also began to expand their private armies. Most of these nobles were originally enemies of Abes. But ever since Count Randner became the enemy of the kingdom, the number of people who wanted to curry favor with him increased day by day. Although Brando did not like these people, he did not reject them at the door. The moon of hazy summer passed by in a flash. Before the moon of scrolls arrived, the land was already filled with the scent of fire. The rising temperature burned the leaves of the trees, and the scorching sun licked the ground of the southern border day after day. Frauda and the Southern Legion's army finally arrived. But before the last festival of summer, I still have to calm my citizens down from their nervousness. Before the last few weeks, he had ordered Abes to hold the Festival of Fires Championship as scheduled. This kind of competition corresponded with the Festival of the Winter Hunt. It was less formal, but because of the open availability of alcohol, it attracted the nobles and knights in the vicinity. The competition venue was set up outside Castle Abes, and the clamor of the competition had almost ignited the entire territory. However, for some quiet places, they still maintained their relative independence. A thin wooden wall separated the sea of noise and the silence of the bar, and only the mercenaries' whistles would occasionally invade this relatively independent space. The hall was filled with the unique smell of cooked meat and spices. Although it was pungent, it gave a strong feeling of home. There were a few tables with unique names written on them, such as Brendel, Romaine, Amandina, etc. They were reserved for the owner or his close friends. The signboard outside the hotel looked brand new. There was a 3-masted ship on it, and the words Lord Romaine's Smuggling Anchorage were written on it. Such a vulgar name naturally belonged to someone. But the decorations in the bar were relatively warm. Scarlet sat at a wooden table in the southwest corner and saw more and more people gathering outside. Most of them were youths of the White Lion Legion, local citizens, and farmers. Ever since the refugees began to flood into Tonajul, the White Lion Legion had expanded beyond the 30 to 40 people that Carglass had when he first joined. Other than that, as more and more people settled in the territory, farmers, merchants, and craftsmen began to fill the countryside of Abes. At this moment, the championship of the summer festival was being held in the open space outside the bar. Now, it was the turn of the archery competition. There were many beautiful tree elves on the field, and the crowd was unprecedentedly large. Scarlet turned around and saw a girl in silver armor placing a bouquet of daisies beside a wooden plate. She then put her hands together and closed her eyes to pray silently. Such a scene was reflected in Scarlet's eyes. She watched quietly and then asked, "Is her name Bess?" Freya opened her eyes, and there was sadness in her brown pupils. She nodded silently and said, "Bess loves crowds. This archery competition must be her favorite. To be able to compete with the legendary tree elves, please don't be sad, Miss Freya. The living have to move on. In the past, the veterans often told us that death is just a nameless monument, and the living have to cross it and carry more things on their backs. That's why we have to be strong. Scarlet comforted her. I'm sorry, I understand. But I can't help but think of the past, especially at times like this. The girl from Butchie blinked her eyes and sighed. Sometimes I really want to go back to that time. How good would it be if there were no wars? I can understand. Scarlet answered carefully. Scarlet looked at Freya and thought for a moment. Then she said, it's because I've been through many battles since I was young. In every battle, there would be a comrade dying. Some of them were newbies that I had just met, while others were close friends that I had spent a lot of time with. When I was still a child, I would cry loudly every time because of this, causing many people to laugh at me. But gradually, I became familiar with the parting of life and death. How? Freya was slightly stunned. She turned around and looked at the girl beside her in disbelief. Scarlet looked slightly younger than her, but her experience showed that she was much more mature. I'm a mercenary. I work for money and survival. People like us will die in the next battle sooner or later. It's a natural ending for us. I've never been dissatisfied. Scarlet seemed to have recalled her past as well. She held the wooden cup in her hand and swirled the golden liquid inside, then quietly said, but because of an accident, my Lord changed me from this life, and let me know that there is another kind of life. I don't know if I should thank Sir Lord. I can more or less understand Sir Lord's thoughts and what he wants me to pursue. But, other than fighting, what else can I do? So compared to him, I'd rather be myself and not others. I can die with a clear conscience. I'm sorry. Freya suddenly said. Scarlet was stunned. I'm sorry, Scarlet. I never knew about your life. I think I'm too selfish to want to go back to the past. Brando is right. If we don't fight for it, no one can give us the peaceful life we want. Freya replied quietly. Erwin is far from being able to covet comfort. The mercenary girl looked at her blankly. Some things that Freya had gradually begun to understand were still in a fog in front of her. At this time, there was a burst of cheers outside the bar. The door of the bar was slammed open. Roman rushed in with a big basin and shouted, Medisha took first place again. The ale is sold out. Come and help. Be careful. Freya quickly reminded him. I know. Then there was a scream from the kitchen, "Ah, my barbecue." Brando helplessly shook his head as he walked in, but he seemed to be in a good mood. He looked at Freya and Scarlet and smiled, "Two beautiful ladies, don't you want to go out and celebrate with everyone? Our little princess took first place in archery." The future Valkyrie stared at him with wide eyes. "Brando, what are you wearing?" "It's a military uniform. Erwin's cavalry uniform." "How is it? Doesn't it look like it?" Brando raised his hand that was holding the barbecue. There were a few obvious oil stains on the dark blue uniform. It was obvious that someone had wiped his hand on it. How can you wipe your hand on the uniform? The uniform represents the dignity of the kingdom. It's the greatest glory of a soldier. Brando, you're too much. Freya was so angry that she forgot about the previous sad incident. Oh, this. It was just convenient. Brando replied innocently. It was convenient. Ha, Freya, you go ahead. I'll go out and take a look. Brando saw that the future Valkyrie was about to lose her temper. Obviously, the things she learned in the Royal Knight Academy had made her feel a little too proud. He quickly laughed and prepared to leave. Stop right there, Brando. At this time, whoever stood still would be an idiot. Brando deeply understood this point. He originally came to show off the cavalry uniform to Freya and Scarlet, but he did not expect that the end result was a little out of his expectations. Fortunately, this small matter could not ruin his good mood at the moment. The cavalry uniform he was wearing came from AB's own cotton and dye workshop. Except for the cotton which was shipped through Ampere Seal, the uniform was almost entirely from Tonajol. This was once a barren land that produced almost nothing other than silver. The reason for the change was the increase in population. Due to the preparations made during the previous war, a large number of refugees were sent to Tonajol. The food reserves from Ampere Seal quickly converted the increased population into usable labor. 2 months ago, under Bosley's leadership, a cotton workshop, a dye workshop, a blacksmith workshop, a copper workshop, a clay and pottery workshop, and even a weapons and armor department were established. After half a year of careful management, Tonajol was no longer a barren land. On the contrary, it was gradually becoming self-sufficient to produce some necessary products. The first was food, weapons, and a small number of luxury goods. After the stormy season, business with the north gradually became more frequent. Sailboats with snow-white sails from Grey Harbor and Ampere Seal anchored at the newly built Deepwater Pier in Port Grey. Merchants with a keen sense of smell also began to discover the potential of this place. Ever since the month of the new moon, the number of merchants living in the port increased day by day. At the same time, there was also a large number of craftsmen. Just a few days ago, Brando met with a group of dwarven enchanters from the Black Mountains. These people were mostly refugees from the war. It was said that the war between the North and the Golden Mane Toquinen had begun to affect normal business. Under the pressure of the Holy Cathedral, the king's eldest son had no choice but to go to war with the Lion Beast men. This was a good opportunity for the South to develop and strengthen. As far as the eye could see, the carriages carrying goods were passing through the main road near Ferber Castle. The fields at the border of the forest were no longer barren, and there were farmers working everywhere. A year ago, or even half a year ago, this would have been a scene that would have been impossible to see in Tonajol. And all of this was brought about by the combined efforts of him and everyone else. He raised his head and looked at the tall riders in the distance, holding high the winner's pennant and galloping around the crowd. The silver flag with the lily embroidered on it fluttered in the wind. 1,000 years ago, it fluttered like this, and 1,000 years later, it fluttered above the earth once more. The crowd burst into thunderous cheers. Brendel saw the silver elf princess being lifted up high by the tree elves. She was also looking at the flag from afar, and there seemed to be something shining in her eyes. Medisha! Medisha! The citizens shouted as they raised their wine glasses high in the air. The straw huts from Grodin's era could no longer be seen on both sides of the streets. With the help of the Red Bronze Dragon mercenaries and Odam's workers, they had built a flat street along Castle Abes. There were neat wooden huts on both sides of the street. The adults and children standing by the huts all had satisfied smiles on their faces. When he passed by the street, someone recognized him, and a large group of people bowed to him sincerely. Brando also returned the greeting. In truth, he was already used to such a life, and no longer felt uneasy when people bowed to him. The knowledge that came from the modern era was slowly fading away. But in the depths of his soul, the pride of an advanced civilization still supported his every word and action. At least, he did not think that this respect and pride was innate. He placed a copper coin in the hands of a little girl beside him. This copper coin represented the blessing from the Lord before midsummer. The little girl was so excited that her face turned red. She held the coin with both hands and ran to the side of a woman. Perhaps it was her mother. The woman took the coin from the little girl's hands and bowed to him. "My lord! My lord!" The shouts quickly changed to a different kind of voice. The people of Abes were expressing their respect for their new lord from the bottom of their hearts. Brando narrowed his eyes. He knew that this feeling of satisfaction was illusory and temporary. Even earlier, the people were still anxiously asking about the upcoming war. In this turbulent era, everyone was trying their best to protect the temporary stability around them. There was nothing wrong with this, but Erwin was far from being safe. Some people were bound to bleed and even give up their lives to protect others. But at least, he wanted to protect Erwin. He walked through the crowd and walked to the side of Her Royal Highness. Griffin was silently watching all of this. The female knight was next to her, one hand on her sword. But Brendel could feel that Maynard was looking at him. In fact, the feeling Maynard gave him was far less intense than when he was in Ampere Seal, which made every nerve in his body tense up. Under such an atmosphere, how could anyone be nervous? They like you very much, Mr. Brando. If there is anyone in Erwin who can be called the model of the ancient nobles, then I can definitely find such qualities in you. Princess Griffin's eyes sparkled as she said with slight emotion. This is the dream of Her Royal Highness. The whole of Erwin, everyone can no longer be trapped by poverty, war, and disaster. The tragedy of Butchie will not happen again. Brando replied. Princess Griffin blinked. Mr. Brando, I understand that this is a little too ideal, but I at least hope to change the kingdom's current situation. In the north, even in Ranner, Viro, and many other places, the war and disasters caused by the nobles themselves are still ongoing, and the descendants of King Eric have done nothing. Yes, so Tonajol will not be peaceful for long. Everyone must fight and sacrifice for their own future. Is Mr. Brando ready? We only need to convince Duke Viro. Medisha was tossed around by the enthusiastic elven girls for a while before being put down. The Silver Elf Princess probably had never experienced such a scene in her life, and her clothes were messed up. Her little face was so red that it was almost dripping blood. The moment she landed on the ground, the tree elves whistled and scattered, probably because they were afraid of retaliation. The winner of our archery competition almost fell to the ground on her butt. Fortunately, Amandina was quick and hurriedly supported her. Those damned girls. Amandina shook her head and handed over Medisha's silver bow. Thank you, Sister Amandina. Medisha said with lingering fear. But when she raised her head and looked at the flag that belonged to the Silver Elf royal family flying high in the distance, her eyes shone with satisfaction. She did not know how many years it had been since this flag appeared in front of people's eyes so brilliantly. The moment she held the bow, her body and mind seemed to have returned to a time in the past. In the wilderness, silver warhorses galloped, and the horn sounded for a long time, as if resonating with the vast earth. Amandina saw that the Silver Elf Princess was a little absent-minded for a moment, and guessed in her heart what she was thinking. She sighed and gently put a cloak on her. Although it was the middle of summer, it was easy to fall sick after sweating and the cold wind blowing. She had long been used to doing these things for Brando, and for a moment she forgot that Medisha was just a heroic spirit. Medisha was slightly startled, and looked at Amandina with some gratitude. Thank you very much, Sister Amandina. This is the second time. Amandina shook her head, not taking it seriously. No, because I thought of my sister. Medisha replied seriously. Is that so? Well, it's probably more gentle. Just like how I imagined my sister, yes, that's it. The Silver Elf Princess smiled sweetly. Amandina looked at Medisa carefully. She had heard some of Medisa's stories and knew that her relationship with her sister was not as harmonious as it seemed. She reached out and smoothed the hair in front of the girl's forehead, and replied, probably between the royal family, it's like this, royal family. Medisha thought for a moment and looked at Amandina. By the way, Sister Amandina, has the Lord still not found the reason? Yes. Amandina also thought of this matter and couldn't help but shake her head. Miss Alaz also checked for me, but I'm not of the Golden Folk bloodline. That time, it was probably the blessing of Lady Martha. The blessing of Lady Martha. Medisha looked at Amandina and suddenly asked, Sister Amandina, where's your necklace? Necklace. Amandina was slightly startled, and subconsciously pressed on her chest. Necklace? Yes, the necklace that I've been wearing before. Before going to Ampere Seal, didn't I always have it with me? I remember seeing it once in the shining sea. Medisha replied softly. That. I lost it before, what's wrong? It's nothing. The silver fairy princess smiled slightly. I didn't expect the meticulous Sister Amandina to lose something. If I tell the Lord, he definitely won't believe me. No need, Amandina hurriedly replied. The Lord is busy preparing for the war with Count Ranner. It's better not to disturb him with these trivial matters. Is that so? Amandina nodded slightly. Medisha thought for a moment, as if she wanted to say something else. But it was at this moment that a commotion suddenly came from a corner of the arena. The crowd over there seemed to be a commotion, and the attention of the two was attracted for a moment. But compared to Medisha, Amandina was after all just an ordinary person. The silver fairy princess quickly discerned what was happening over there. Ha! She said softly. What's wrong? Amandina looked in that direction in vain as she turned back and asked. Some strange guys have come. Medisha murmured. For Tosancade Forest, the rainy weather that had lasted for many days seemed to have begun to patronize Magi Tan and the nearby areas after a short period of sunny weather. For the residents of the Misty Forest, it seemed that there were not many good days since Duke Arek's visit. The gloomy sky that brought the rain always hovered above their heads, although the beginning of the rainy season in the Tosancade region was 4 or 5 months. But this year, it was a little too ridiculous. The wooden fence gate creaked and swayed in the torrential rain as it was lifted up. In the curtain of rain, a pair of cold eyes silently watched the rain slide down the fence gate, falling from the tip like a pillar with a broken string, and then mixed into the muddy water. 2 attendants held up a cloak for Count Ranner to block the continuous rain. The Count, who had the privilege of the kingdom, silently watched the carriage on the drawbridge drive out of the outer city under the guidance of the guards. Then he turned back and quickly disappeared above the city walls. Duke Arek held up the curtain of the carriage with one hand, withdrew his gaze from that direction, and sneered softly. The carriage fell into darkness again. This old fox is really careful and greedy. Indecisiveness and stubbornness are his biggest weaknesses. I'm afraid this is a typical weakness of the nobles, Your Grace. A woman's voice replied, but at least we managed to convince this guy, so this trip was not in vain. He will regret it. The hoarse voice laughed coldly. It's just that he doesn't have a choice, but he might not be sincere about joining us. Come to think of it, how could such a mediocre noble understand such profound principles? Duke Arek shook his head. But Duke Cohen, this guy is indeed not trustworthy. You'd better make plans. He reminded again. We're already prepared. The hoarse voice replied gloomily, he's just a scapegoat. Arek nodded and looked in that direction with an inexplicable gaze. The towering walls of Magi Tan had long become a faint shadow in the curtain of rain. Then he put down the curtain, and the carriage returned to darkness again. In a direction that he could not see, Count Ranner was accompanied by a knight as he walked down the spiral staircase of the castle. The dim light in the corridor shone on his face. The once arrogant Count of the kingdom was now filled with cold doubts. Father, do you really intend to form an alliance with those things? A figure was already waiting below. The noble youth looked up and asked impatiently, once we agree, we will have no way out. Count Ranner looked at his second son, do we have a way out now? It seems like you still don't understand your situation. No, I mean, enough. Count Ranner interrupted him impatiently, I know what you want to say, and of course I will make preparations. Madara. At least Madara sighed. He sighed, forget it, you go and contact Cruz's people. Cruz's people. There are always some things that they need to know. The Count was silent for a moment, and replied faintly. P.S. The third day. I went out to do something today, so I'm much later. Sob, sob, sob. So be it. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 683. In Medisha's line of sight, a group of strangely dressed knights had already caught her attention. The knights stopped by the side of the road and all stopped to watch on their horses. They had different expressions on their faces, but most of them were a little curious. In the countryside of Tonajol, apart from the White Lion guards and Brando's subordinates, it was rare to see such a knight in bright armor. However, even the White Lion guards would not embellish their breastplates with a flame emblem. Moreover, their armor was not made in the style of Aween's locals. On the contrary, the armor on their bodies was dark red in color and was decorated with more fur and keratin elements. This was the typical style of armor of the people of Cruz. The color of the armor was also due to the fact that the local steel produced in Cruz was mixed with more fire elements. Some strange visitors have come. Medisha pondered for a moment and understood the other party's identity. But why would Cruz's envoys appear in Tonajol at this time of year? Lorena put down the iron handguard that blocked the sun and looked at the windmill and large tracts of farmland in the distance. But her gaze swept over the lax defense of Abe's castle, and a slight look of contempt appeared on her face. Castle Abe's had lacked repair since Grodden's time, and Brando only used it as a temporary residence with no intention of repainting it. So the female knight from Cruz could easily see the holes in the dilapidated castle. I didn't expect there to be such a place in the countryside of Erewhon the further south we go. In comparison, we've been to some places in the north of the kingdom, and the current scene is far less prosperous than here. Isn't it said that there's only a barren wilderness left in the south of Yusong? She muttered to herself, but her attention was attracted by the championship tournament that was being held nearby. The crowd outside Abe's castle made her turn her head and carefully observe the knight who was on the field. The records you've seen are from a few years ago. It's not surprising that there might be some changes, a female voice replied. Lorena did not have to turn her head to know whose voice it was. No doubt it was a very distinctive voice, for it was impressionable in every way. The unhurried tone was quiet and elegant, and unforgettable. It was as if the owner of the voice had already thought it through before saying such words. If Brando were here, he would definitely recognize the owner of the voice. The lady who was protected in the middle by many Kurlutz knights looked like she was only 18 or 19 years old, but she had a kind of mystery and sexiness that did not match her age. She was the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Kurlutz Empire, Delphine, whom he had met once in the Black Forest. The Prime Minister's daughter quietly observed everything here. Her long black hair hung down like silk, and her eyes seemed to contain a natural mystery, giving people an unfathomable quiet aura. She obviously attracted the most attention on horseback. After all, such beauty was rare even in the most prosperous areas of Erewhon and Cruz, let alone in Tonajol. So much so that the local people couldn't help but take a few more glances at her. Their curiosity stemmed from the fact that there was a woman in the world more beautiful than the Lord's fiancée and Her Royal Highness the Princess. However, Delphine was wearing the robe of a Cruz noble civil official, more like a diplomatic envoy. Her robe was dyed dark purple, rather than the gold or red commonly seen in areas where people believed in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. This outfit further explained her identity. Miss Delphine, do you know anything? Lorena turned and asked. Delphine nodded. As far as I know, the Count only became the lord of this place not long ago. So the changes here are likely to be related to him. She answered calmly, only pausing slightly when she mentioned Brando. Lorena glanced at the Prime Minister's daughter and thought for a moment without saying anything. She knew that the man Delphine liked in the Black Forest had died indirectly because of the lord they were about to meet. She took the initiative to go this time, probably not just to deliver a letter. The female knight changed the subject and pretended to ask, "It's him. I didn't expect the Lord to have such outstanding political talent. I heard he's still very young, isn't he?" "Yes, very young. I've met the Count once before," Delphian said lightly, but to say that he's talented in politics is an exaggeration. "The Count has control of Tonnagel's silver mines, and I heard that he has recently excavated a crystal mine. Everything at present is just a temporary illusion built by piling up wealth." "I think so too. This is just a third-rate competition. But it's okay, at least it's quite lively." The young knight sitting behind Lorena yawned and even looked at the scene in front of him disinterestedly. However, he forced himself to perk up. "But it seems like we're quite lucky to have bumped into these country bumpkins' celebration. Maybe the local lord will be tactful enough to treat us to a sumptuous banquet. Ever since we left Ampere Seal, the taste in my mouth has almost become a companion of weeds." "What weeds? Those are wild vegetables." Lorena glared at the guy. If it were any other knight in the team, naturally they wouldn't dare to be so presumptuous in front of her, the knight captain. But the man in front of her was His Majesty the Emperor's younger brother, the eldest son of Prince Burano, and her fiancé. Originally, he wasn't on the list for this operation, but this guy still followed them all the way on the pretext of protecting her. Martha above, God knew she didn't need this guy's protection at all. As an official knight captain of the Azure Skies Legion, she was more than capable of fighting two of this guy. But Lorena sighed in the end. As a political marriage, she didn't have much of a good impression of the other party, but she didn't have much of a bad impression either. Although this guy's nature was a bit nasty, compared to some of the nobles in the capital, he was still barely acceptable. The young knight shrugged, "Well, you have the final say." He looked around and said, "But I don't know if there will be a legendary bonfire party tonight. Think about it, maybe there will be a passionate mountain girl who will take a fancy to me. I'm really looking forward to it." He turned his head and raised his voice, "Don't you think so, Lorena?" The female knight replied coldly, "Enough, Philas, don't cause trouble. No one here cares whose heir you are. You'd better know who the lord here is." Her tone was unfriendly, and it was obvious that this guy had caused her a lot of trouble along the way. But Lorena also knew that her words might not have any binding force on the other party. Fortunately, this was only Erwin, not Cruz. In such a small kingdom, the local lords would at most express their dissatisfaction verbally. "Of course I know. That count is famous in Ampere Seal this time and made us suffer a big loss. Didn't the Duke of Flowerleaf and the Grand Duke of Noshk both say that we Cruz people haven't lost so much face in the last 100 years? The Cruz people will naturally remember such a great kindness." Philas was talking nonsense when he suddenly saw Lorena staring at him coldly. He quickly shuddered, "Well, I understand. For Lady Veronica's sake, I won't trouble him. Although I also promised that little girl Vahina." Okay, I understand. I'll listen to you, dear Miss Lorena. Philas, if it weren't for your father's sake, I really wouldn't want to marry you." The female knight replied coldly. I know. I won't say it anymore, okay?" The young knight hurriedly calmed his fiancée's anger. At least he knew that it was his honor to marry the genius of the capital and the daughter of the Duke. The female knight thought that the source of trouble in the group had finally calmed down for a while, and she turned back to find the local lord. But she didn't expect to hear a long whistle behind her before she could breathe a sigh of relief. "Lorena, look over there." Philas whistled and suddenly shouted excitedly. Usually, when this young master was in high spirits, nothing good would happen. Sure enough, when Lorena turned back, she saw. But Lorena had just turned back, and before she could breathe a sigh of relief, she immediately heard Philas whistle a long whistle. A large group of people was coming down the road, clustered around a little girl. But she had to admire her fiancé's taste, because it was indeed a rare beauty. The girl was no more than 16 or 17 years old, and like many girls in the countryside, she had her hair pulled up to show a forehead as smooth as jade for ease of work. But she was wearing a thick, traveler's leather outfit, which was very common in the southern part of Erewhon. Standing in the crowd, she looked very unique and eye-catching. Philas, don't mess with others. Lorena knew that her fiancé actually cared a lot about her, but his active nature made this guy always unable to resist flirting, but only verbally. This guy had suffered a lot at the hands of some rich young lady, but he didn't look like he was going to learn his lesson. Her words obviously didn't have any effect, because Philas was completely energized. He whistled as loud as he could. Since leaving the Empire and passing through so many areas, he had never seen such an outstanding girl somewhere, except, of course, his own fiancée and the daughter of the Empire's Prime Minister, whom he couldn't touch. We, the young prince's son from the Cruz Empire, naturally saw the Roman. After the merchant lady managed to save a few pieces of roast meat from the kitchen, she ran out and found that Brando was nowhere to be seen, so she simply continued to peddle ale alone along the street. Since she was out in the open all year round, almost all the people of Abes knew the fiancé of their very kind lord. But no one dared to take advantage of her, and instead bought the ale from her with a smile. It was also an honor to be able to drink ale sold by the lord's wife herself. But the Roman was holding an empty basin in one hand and the banner of the silver fairy princess, which she had swindled out of God knows where, talking happily with the people around her, apparently oblivious to the Cruz knights on this side. Of course, she couldn't be blamed. After all, in this lively season, there were horsemen and guards in festive costumes everywhere. For the average citizen, not many people could tell the difference between the armor of the Kurlutz people and Owen's own standard armor. For our merchant lady, of course, it was even harder to tell. Anyway, they were all dressed like tin cans, and they didn't have the pointed ears of elves, so they all looked the same, didn't they? Besides, who would have thought that a Cruz knight would appear in such a remote place? It wasn't until a shadow appeared in front of her, as if blocking the sun, that the Roman looked up slightly and saw the tall Cruz knight in front of her. Philas urged his horse in front of the Roman, and with one hand on the reins, he turned the horse around. Because this move was played so beautifully, a few knights from other areas around them cheered, and Philas himself was very satisfied. In his impression, this move was more than enough to intimidate a few Erewhon country bumpkins. "Beautiful lady, may I have the honor of knowing your name?" He looked up, wanting to see the look of worship he imagined. He had often played this trick in the alfalfa wilderness, and along the way, so he was already familiar with it, and every time he did it, he would win a lot of cheers and eyeballs. But this time, Philas found that he was destined to be disappointed. Because he narrowed his eyes and found that the Erewhon country bumpkins in front of him were not looking at him with worship, but rather, they were looking at him as if he was an idiot. That look seemed to say, "Where did this country bumpkin come from?" To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 684. The young knight could not help but widen his eyes, almost suspecting that he was hallucinating. He had seen peasants and travelers in many parts of the country, and even some of the bolder merchants, but none of them did not tremble in the presence of a nobleman such as himself, and had never seen such an insolent look on his face. In fact, Roman's mouth was also agape as she stared at this guy in a daze. Because the merchant lady's reaction was a beat slower than the others, she was still trying to think, and had no idea how the person in front of her appeared. If it were not for her basic common sense, she would have thought that the other party had fallen from the sky. It had to be said that after such a ridiculous idea ran through her mind, she asked seriously, who are you? Are you looking for Brando?" "Brando?" Philas finally reacted, but unfortunately, as a noble, he had obviously only heard of the title of Count of Tonnagel, and had never heard of the existence of Brando. He thought for a moment, and felt that the country girl in front of him was probably scared silly by him, so he changed to a gentle smile and continued, "No, I'm here for you, beautiful lady. My name is Philas, the future heir of the Barano family." Roman thought for a moment, "You know me?" "No." Philas heard his fiancée giggle behind him, and could not help but feel a little annoyed. He had been successful since he left the Empire, but today he seemed to have hit a snag. "This should be the first time we've met, beautiful lady." "Ah, I see." The merchant lady seemed to have finally reacted. "You want to buy my wine, right? You know your stuff. Roman has the best ale in all of Tonnagel, no, all of Erewhon." For the first time, she realized that the tall knight in front of her might be a potential customer, so she began to introduce him without stopping. "No, stop." Although Philas finally knew the name of the girl in front of him, he could not help but say hurriedly, "I don't want to buy your ale." "You're not buying wine." "I'm not buying." Roman narrowed her eyes slightly. She finally understood that the other party wasn't trying to bargain with her. Thus, she thought for a moment and decided to show the ruthless side of a merchant. She didn't even say a word and directly walked around this guy. Ross immediately heard a roar of laughter. Not only the country bumpkins, but even the cruise knight and Lorena behind him couldn't help but laugh. Our young knight could not hold on any longer. He instinctively reached out to grab the Roman flag. "I say, wait a minute." Unfortunately, before he could touch the flagpole in his opponent's hand, a silver light suddenly shot out from the crowd. Philas was still an official knight, and he reacted in the nick of time, immediately pulling out the long sword at his waist in an instant. With a crisp sound, the two shining swords clashed together. The huge force caused Philas' body to lean back slightly, and then he realized that the person who blocked his sword was an equally outstanding female knight. Freya was wearing a silver-white lion armor and holding the Lionheart sword high in her hand. She looked coldly at the cruise knight on horseback. She did not move, but firmly blocked Philas' attack with one hand on the ground. Upper silver level. Philas stared at the female knight in front of him and could not help but be slightly surprised. With just one exchange of blows, he estimated that the other party's strength was about the same as his, but it seemed that the other party was much younger than him. Freya was now only in her early 20s, but he knew very well that he had probably been practicing swordsmanship for more than 20 years. There was such a genius in this remote countryside. Philas frowned slightly and estimated that the other party's talent might be similar to his fiancée's. Of course, he did not know that Freya's strength had advanced by leaps and bounds after the Battle of Ampere-Seal. Before going to the port city, the progress of her strength was probably far inferior to his. But combined with the previous rumors, it was enough to make him frown. He knew that the local lord was a famous genius among Erewhon's people, but he did not expect that the other party also had such a capable subordinate. Philas was frivolous, but he was not a fool. "Who are you? Who are you?" Philas and Freya asked at the same time. "We are a delegation of Cruz's people." At this moment, a voice came from behind and ordered, "Philas, surrender her sword." Philas was stunned and turned his head, only to find that the person who gave the order was the Prime Minister's daughter, Delphian. He saw the woman looking coldly at him and ordered mercilessly, "Philas, now you represent the face of the Empire. If she dares to resist, kill her." "Miss Delphian." Lorena, of course, heard Delphian's order clearly. She was shocked. She had thought that Delphian would come to trouble the Lord, but she did not expect the other party to be so decisive and kill as soon as she opened her mouth. Of course, whether to kill or not was not her concern. The point was, if it was Philas who did it, she knew very well that her fiancé would definitely get into big trouble here. But unexpectedly, Delphian seemed to have made up her mind. She looked coldly at the female knight and said, "Lorena, you should know that the dignity of the Empire is not to be blasphemed. Showing your sword to an envoy of the Empire for no reason is tantamount to a declaration of war. But she didn't do it on purpose. We can ask the local lord to apologize for it. Lorena was also panicking. She never dreamed that Delphine would just throw such a big hat at her. No need. No need. Before the female knight finished speaking, Delphine and Freya replied in unison. Freya separated the Roman with one hand and stared coldly at these people. If it weren't for you Cruz people, Beth wouldn't have died. But you have never learned from the tragedies of others, and I will never apologize to people like you. Maybe you think you're born to be better than others, but one day you'll understand the price of making the right and wrong choices, Erwin's future Valkyrie scolded angrily. The Valkyrie emblem on her forehead suddenly became dazzling. A pair of wings of light spread out from her back in an instant, and a bright white flame burned from the palm of her right hand, turning the Lionheart sword in her hand into a sword burning with holy flames. Ah! Lorena had wanted to dissuade Delphine, but suddenly felt the female knight in front of Philas's aura skyrocketing. In an instant, she broke through the limits between the upper silver and the peak silver, and was even faintly approaching the realm of gold. Another 20-year-old gold rank existence. Her expression changed, and she immediately warned, Philas, be careful. But it was still a little too late. Freya, who was completely enraged by the Prime Minister's daughter, slashed her sword upwards. The terrifying power was so terrifying that Philas could not resist at all, and he was directly swept off the back of his horse. Then the Valkyrie took a step forward, and the wings of light behind her flapped gently. She was already off the ground, and as if flying, she flew straight towards Delphine. Oh my God, Seraph! Cruz's knight couldn't help but exclaim. However, their exclamations apparently didn't attract the attention of the onlookers around them. The people probably didn't expect the two sides to fight just like that, and immediately scattered in an uproar. Some people fled in the direction of the arena, while the more rational ones went straight in the direction of the Lord. Damn it, Philas! Lorena saw her fiancé being sent flying and finally couldn't care less. She immediately unsheathed her long sword and faced Freya head-on. As soon as she made her move, the faces of the knight from all over Tonajol, who was rushing over from the arena in the distance, immediately changed. If Freya was only close to the gold rank, then the terrifying aura of the female knight was the true pinnacle of the gold rank. Delphine, who was behind all the Cruz knight, couldn't help but sneer when she saw this scene. Philas didn't recognize the Roman and Freya, but it didn't mean that she knew nothing about the Count of Tonajol. Now Freya couldn't help but make a move, but how much chance did the other party have of surviving in front of the #1 genius girl of the city of Rusta? She probably already had the answer in her heart. Even in Kurlutz, only a few people knew about this secret. The seemingly docile female knight in front of him was, in fact, the next successor of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to the Grand Commander of the Holy Knights. The reason was actually very simple. Lorena was the only person in Cruz who could learn the entire set of flash strike sword technique in 400 years. Freya quickly realized this as well. Although she said that she wanted to teach these Cruz people a lesson, it didn't mean that the future Valkyrie of Erwin had completely lost her mind. Her first target was actually Delphine, who was protected by the Cruz Knight, after she sent Philas flying in front of her. Freya, of course, had already seen that it was the inhumanly beautiful woman who was behind the scenes instigating the relationship between the Erwin people and the Cruz people. Although she didn't understand why the other party was doing this, subduing the other party first was undoubtedly the most direct way. But she was right about one thing, but she didn't expect the development after that. As soon as she drew her sword, she only saw the female knight, whom she hadn't paid much attention to before, flash slightly on horseback, and then a sharp sword appeared in front of her. Flash strike sword technique. Because Brando was also good at the same swordsmanship, Freya had of course seen this swordsmanship before, and even experienced it herself. But in her memory, Brando's flash strike sword technique was far less stunning than the one she was seeing now. The sharp blade appeared in front of her forehead without any warning, and it looked as if she had bumped into it herself instead of the other party stabbing at her. Freya was shocked and hurriedly raised her head to try to avoid the sword, but it was still a little too late, and the blade directly drew a line of blood on her forehead. The Valkyrie gritted her teeth, and the stinging pain on her forehead almost made her see black, but fortunately, it wasn't a fatal wound. She desperately flapped her wings of light and turned around in mid-air, but before she could breathe a sigh of relief, scarlet blood gushed out of her arms, shoulders, and lower abdomen at the same time. Freya screamed, and she couldn't believe how she had been hit. It felt as if Lorena's sword had appeared in countless directions of attack at the same time. So this was the real flash strike sword technique. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheatien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 685. Freya's eyes widened as she fell from mid-air. She watched as the female knight swung her sword at her again, but she was too seriously injured to dodge. She couldn't help but close her eyes, her heart cold. But an exclamation replaced the tragic scene that should have happened, which everyone couldn't bear to watch. In front of everyone's eyes, an azure spear firmly blocked the long sword in Lorena's hand with a clang. The female knight immediately realized that the other party had companions as reinforcements and subconsciously wanted to withdraw her sword and retreat, but the next moment, she was surprised to find that she couldn't move. How could this be? Lorena was shocked. Ever since she learned the flash strike sword art, she had never encountered such a thing. She found that she wasn't unable to move because of some magic, but she felt that the space in front of her, which was originally under her control, suddenly became obscure, and the blade that moved freely in it seemed to have fallen into a layer of condensed ice. She raised her head in horror and looked at the girl with the ponytail standing in front of her. Scarlet didn't say a word and stared at her coldly with the azure spear in her hand. Another girl at the peak of gold. Although Lorena had long known of Brando's strength, she never dreamed that a mere Tonagel would hide so many geniuses, as if all the monsters of Erewhon were gathered here. And it was at this moment that a cold voice came. The flash strike sword art uses spatial movement to directly cause damage, so under the invincible fate, even the spatial movement effect is left with less than 10% of the effect. It's true that everything has its nemesis. Hearing this voice, Delphian, who was standing behind all the night, suddenly changed her expression. Count Tonagel. The woman seemed to be gnashing her teeth as she said the name. She subconsciously wanted to retreat, but the voice shouted first, the county. As soon as the voice fell, an invisible shackle fell from the sky and fell on every Cruz person present. Then, a somewhat cold voice reached the ears of these knights, don't worry. Spatial laws, freeze. Brando's figure had actually emerged from the crowd. He parted the crowd and caught Freya, who was falling from the air. He raised his head and stared coldly at the daughter of the Prime Minister of Cruz. Madam, I believe we've met once in the loop of trade winds. Did Veronica send you here to tell me that Cruz is ready to declare war on Erewhon? If that's the case, I'll accompany you at any time. Brando's words caused an uproar. The holy palace of Alodner was shrouded in a cloud of mist all year round. The empty floor of the obsidian hall reflected a dim blue light, as dark as a mirror. In the darkness, the pillars of the dead, which were stacked with 120 white bones, supported the Gothic dome formed by layers of bones. Here, it was said that the breath of a living person would be instantly frozen into ice crystals that resembled glass shards. Therefore, the hall was always chilled to the bone, and the hungry wail that passed through the pillars was like the ravings of a lunatic lingering above the vault. The residents of the Silent Bay believed that the hunger wail was the scream of the ghouls that crawled out from the abyss. The people of Wonde often believed that the breath of the dead would form wind, so it lingered in the air. But in fact, such a natural landscape had already existed here long before the founding of Madara. Note, the bay between the north of Erewhon and St. Tossel today. In the faint whistling of the wind, the Black Knight in black robes passed through the pillars, the metal hook-shaped ornaments at the end of their cloaks clanking as they were dragged along. These dark courtiers passed by the huge broodmother of the spirit realm crouching on both sides of the pillars of the dead. Under the gaze of their 4 pairs of lantern-like eyes, they stood in 2 rows in the center of the hall without saying a word. They were as silent as one. Insershta the dragon stood at the end of the hall, side by side with Tarkus, watching the scene with interest. Unlike most of the old-fashioned, decaying undead that seemed to have burned out like their lives, Insershta had a wide range of knowledge. He knew the scenery of the ancient kingdom opposite the Black Bermonti Rose, the splendid culture of the Cruz people, and even most of the mortal literature in the area of Erewhon and Cruz often recorded that the Black Knight was an undead creature in armor. In fact, contrary to most of the rumors circulating, the Black Knight of Hull was a very special kind of undead even in Madara. Most of their territories were near the inland sea of the Dead Moon, and they maintained the cold and elegant habits of life. When the dead were alive, the oath was engraved on the armor, and the soul fire lingered around the obsession of the living, driven by the fire of revenge. This was the origin of the Black Knight. Their stubbornness was famous even in Madara. Although people often said that they were as stubborn as the rotten bones of Madara, the Black Knight was especially stubborn. The living knight adhered to dogma, but these dead knights were forever trapped by oaths and curses. Insershta the dragon thought that they could be called the Madara of Madara for the time being. He looked at the scene with a playful face, which was incompatible with the stern-faced Tarkus beside him. A buzzing voice sounded in the hall, "In the name of the moon of eternal darkness and the black flower, the supreme king of the kingdom of darkness, the wielder of Loki's staff, please accept the allegiance and tribute of the lords from the east." The voice seemed to stretch the empty hall further, and it spread to the other end of the hall, but there was no response for a long time. Above the hall, the Supreme One on the throne waited for a moment before softly grunting. The Black Knight bowed their heads. Cheers for His Majesty's majesty. After even the territory of the Sea of the Dead Moon has surrendered, the unification of the Kingdom of Darkness after 1,000 years is almost at hand. Other than that woman Yalvit, who still has no idea what she's thinking, there's only the land of spiders left. Tarkus, the Dead Moon is rising. It's really exciting to be able to participate in this kind of history. Insershta the dragon looked at the Black Knight bowing their heads and couldn't help but whisper to his companion. Anticipation is not a feeling that the dead should have, Tarkus replied faintly, and even his expression rarely changed. As the noblest vampire of the Manlian family, he was allowed to wear a black noble robe with golden edges in this hall. Standing next to the Insershta dragon who had no status, he looked extremely comical. Madara has begun to act according to the will of the Mercury Staff. It's like a curse rather than a goal. The world of the living is nothing in the eyes of the dead. In my opinion, only time, truth and dust have value. That's why the humans outside call us stubborn skeletons. But the show has just begun. Tarkus, the arrival of the Black Knight today is just an appetizer. Insershta the dragon didn't feel any embarrassment because of his low status. Instead, he was in high spirits. You see, His Majesty summoned the blood staff back. It must be because something good has happened. Tarkus didn't say a word. In fact, he already knew what had happened. A week ago, in the territory west of Madara near the kingdom of Erewhon, 2 dark nobles were attacked by humans. One of the vampires' castles was almost completely burned to ashes, leaving behind a large number of traces of purification. Almost no undead creatures could escape. In other words, at least one of the knights of the Holy Cathedral of Fire had sneaked into Madara's territory. For such an incident to happen at this time of the year, he smelled a strong scent of conspiracy. Although such things were not uncommon on the border between Erewhon and Madara, the humans responded to the call of the Holy Cathedral, and the undead plundered each other's territory. Between the two sides, there were often knights privately forming armies to invade each other's territory. However, since Erwin's Oberth VI ascended to the throne, Madara switched from defense to offense and gradually took the initiative in the war. But today was different. The peace treaty between Erwin and Madara had only been signed for a year, and it was said that the human kingdom was caught in a civil war. Obviously, they wouldn't start a war at this time. In that case, it was very suspicious as to who was trying to fish in troubled waters. The indifferent vampire narrowed his remaining eye. He raised his head and saw that the Dark Lord who had taught Erwin a painful lesson in Karsuk was like what the Insursta dragon had said. The blood staff dressed in a blood-red robe, the king of necromancers, Jug, slowly walked into the center of the hall. "Your Majesty, I have brought news that is not so delightful. Those lowly humans are now challenging Your Majesty in Madara's territory. The pain that the war a year ago brought to them seems to have faded from those stubborn human nobles. Today, I am here to ask for your permission to let me bring them new horror." The hoarse voice of the blood staff echoed under the vault of the holy palace of Eliudner, but Tarkus and the Insursta dragon narrowed their eyes slightly. Brando threw the letter in Delphine's hand lightly in front of her. He looked at this woman carefully. In fact, he had already met her once at the exchange of trade winds, but at that time, he had only seen her from afar. He did not look at her as closely as he did today. He had to admit that her beauty was enough to make anyone admire her. Among all the women he had seen, only Princess Griffin could compare to her. But compared to her vicious heart, Her Highness the Princess was as innocent as a child. "Miss Delphine, although I don't know how I have offended you. But you don't have to take revenge on me at all costs. Lord Veronica asked you to pass this message to me. Speaking of which, it seems that you Cruz people do not intend to start a war with us Erewhon people. Instead, you want to ask me for a favor." He paused for a moment, and could not help but say sarcastically, "If she knew that you are here to give me a condition, I'm afraid she would not be satisfied." The Prime Minister's daughter did not say a word. She stared at him coldly, but the hatred in her eyes was like that of a venomous snake. This made Brando frown. Even in his wildest dreams, he could not imagine how he had offended her to make her look like she hated him so much. But fortunately, he did not need this woman to speak. He took a look at the letter, and he already knew the contents of the letter. He raised his head, silently estimating which historical event this was. The Bloodstaff's self-directed drama had happened before in history. He had thought that because history had been completely changed, all of this would not happen again. He did not expect that the unlucky corpse wizard king would still send this trouble to him. But Brando squinted his eyes, and was not too worried in his heart. To him, this was a rare opportunity. It was rare to encounter a familiar historical event, and such a good thing might not happen again in the future. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 686. At the end of the Sword's Year, there was indeed a second invasion by the Bloodstaff in history. The unruly corpse wizard king colluded with Count Randner to create trouble in an attempt to create an excuse to invade Elson. The deeper intention was to break away from the control of the Supreme Emperor of Madara, or at least weaken his prestige. So this was a good show directed by the Bloodstaff. It was just that some people had planned the opening of the show, but did not expect the final outcome. The Bloodstaff that once swept through the eastern region of Karsuk completely buried itself in this war. First, it was defeated by the allied forces of Eek, Yura, and Duke Viro. Then, in the process of retreating to the Land of Spiders, it was ambushed by the army of the Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, who claimed that she was unwilling to submit to the Mercury Staff, and then died. Not long after its death, the territory it originally ruled in the Blood Forest was divided. Insersta inherited the largest part of it. Then, the Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, also surrendered to the Supreme Emperor of Madara after a symbolic resistance. No matter how one looked at it, it seemed as if the corpse wizard king had dug a hole and buried himself in it. Before Insersta left Aween, he had secretly communicated with Count Randner. But in the next moment, this lovely count went to the blood staff to conspire with him. Perhaps only the blood staff's empty, dark corroded mind of the corpse wizard would think that there was nothing fishy about this. The Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, was also a big suspect, but this was not something Brando was concerned about. What moved him was that he realized that this September conflict in history would bring him a huge opportunity. It might even allow him to completely solve the trouble in the southern region in one fell swoop. If his plan was successful, then Her Highness would have at least 1 to 2 years of development after unifying the southern region. Even before the Emperor of Madara was ready, if Erwin was prepared to deal with the war in advance, maybe the new Black Rose would seriously consider the route to the west. Brando was lost in thought for a moment. His finger tapped lightly on the envelope. Only he could see the opportunity in the letter. He clearly remembered this point in history. During the autumn moon of the Year of the Sword, the Blood Staff would choose to head east from today's Butchie and enter Grimoires from the Silman region. They would then meet up with Count Randner at the border of the northern Tosincade forest. After that, Bloodstaff's army marched north to attack Kirkle, the capital of Grimoires, in an attempt to open up a path to Viro from the west of Lake Valendan. However, the undead army was ambushed by the allied forces of Eek, Yura, and Duke Viro near Shallow Water Town. The Blood Staff was killed by Yalvit in the process of retreating to the Land of Spiders. The Princess and Duke Arek's army also attacked the capital of Randner's territory, Majedon. The September conflict started in the month of harvest and lasted for more than a month until the middle of the month of autumn. After that, both Madara and Erwin refused to admit that it was a war. They reached a consensus in writing that it was a border conflict where the lords privately plundered and retaliated. Brando personally participated in the war as a player at that time. Not long after that, Count Randner was expelled and fled to Madara. He joined Insersta's forces, but that was no longer something that Brando cared about. He raised his head and stared at the huge map of Erwin's southern border that was hung on one side of the wall of the castle hall in Abes. His gaze was always wandering on one of the lines. That line started from Silman in the south and reached Kirkle Castle in the north. In history, the Blood Staff had once attacked Kirkle, but this time, Brando obviously would not give the Lich so many benefits. The southern border was now in the princess's pocket, and Brando was not so generous as to give his things to others. The key was that this was the best opportunity to rope in Duke Grimoires, and Duke Viro would definitely join in. Now, he could only hope that Old Man Arek would also join in the chaos. If their allied forces were completely destroyed, then the war in the southern border would in fact be over. Brando's gaze stopped at the Silman area where the war started, and he suddenly thought of some people. Those people should have gained a foothold by now. Then the plan was set. He curled his finger and lightly tapped on the table. This action made Amandina, who was at the side, tremble slightly. Amandina, who was familiar with him, knew very well that he had already decided on the next plan. As expected, Brando raised his head. He first glanced at Delphian, who was pressed down on the chair by Scarlet. This woman made him a little puzzled, but the fact that she ordered her subordinates to hurt Freya angered him even more. The Valkyrie had come to him with bandages on and told him not to be impulsive, but it was precisely because of this that Brando's heart became even colder. He pondered for a moment. A murderer should be prepared to be killed. This woman had sinister intentions. Although she did not succeed in the end, at least she had attempted to kill. Moreover, it was not her own conscience that made her stop. If Scarlet was not present at the time, Freya and even the Roman would not have been able to escape death. However, envoys were not killed in a war between two armies. Although this envoy had done some despicable things, Brando was not so petty as to argue with a woman. Besides, if he killed Delphian just like that, Freya would most likely feel guilty. He did not want to leave any grudges with the future Valkyrie because of this small matter. However, he could avoid death, but he could not escape punishment. Moreover, Brando believed that sometimes death was a kind of relief. This venomous woman was glaring at him with a face full of resentment. She was the daughter of Prime Minister Cruz, and her status seemed to be very high. If she died, there would be a real war between Erwin and Cruz. Brando stared at her. No matter how he looked at it, he felt that her deep purple eyes were filled with hatred. "My lord." Amandina seemed to have seen through his thoughts and asked in a low voice. "I don't want to see this woman for the time being. She was born with such a beautiful face, but her heart is disgustingly ugly. Take her to the water dungeon under AB's castle. I believe Lady Veronica will give me a satisfactory answer." Brando replied coldly. "Water dungeon?" Amandina asked in disbelief. She could not help but look at Delphian with some sympathy. Compared to that, perhaps it would be better to be executed directly. The dungeons under Coldwood Castle were built during Grodin's time. The water dungeons at the bottom were covered with a layer of iron cages, and the water was waist-deep. It was impossible for anyone to change the water in the dungeons. There were countless corpses of humans, rats, and other creatures in there. There were also some things that she could not bring herself to mention. She could not possibly ask the prisoners to give up on excreting, right? It was hard for her to imagine what would happen to the daughter of the Prime Minister after being locked up for a few days. A woman as beautiful as her was impossible not to love beauty. Besides, Brando wanted to wait for Veronica's reply. In other words, if Veronica did not give him a reply, it was estimated that Delphian would be locked up for the rest of her life. Amandina felt her hair stand on end just thinking about it. But she could not help but sigh when she looked at Delphian. This woman only had herself to blame. When she had ordered people to hurt Freya, the entire territory had almost been stirred up. "I understand." She nodded and replied softly. Then she was ready to order the soldiers to drag the daughter of the Prime Minister away. But it was at this moment that Lorena, who was restrained to a chair by the Shire's spell, saw this scene and could not help but plead, "My lord." Although she was the one who had actually hurt Freya, she and her fiancé were treated the best. The other Cruz knight were directly tied to the ground, while she and Philas were just confined to chairs by magic. From this point, the female knight could vaguely feel that the count in front of her did not seem to be such an unreasonable person. Besides, as a knight from the army, she knew very well what kind of place the dungeon was. Delphian, who was born in a noble family, would never stay in that kind of place for more than a day. But she did not expect that as soon as she opened her mouth, Brando interrupted her and said, "Lady Lorena, I know you are an upright and kind knight. You know very well what would have happened if I had not been able to stop that scene at the time. If Freya had died, or even if she had been seriously injured, would have immediately declared war on Cruz." He glanced at the female knight. In fact, he let Lorena and Philas sit in chairs not because he saw that they were innocent, but because Lorena and Philas were still somewhat famous in history. They were the few Cruz commanders that Brando appreciated more. The title of the upright Lorena was still circulating on the earth even after the Holy War, and he believed that she would not attack Freya for no reason. "Don't doubt my ability," he paused and continued, "Lady Lorena, I'm sure you're already well aware of my relationship with the Ash Sword Saint. If Erwin had become enemies with Cruz because of this, then what awaited the two kingdoms would have been a bloody end. Just because of this woman's selfishness, hundreds and thousands of people would have died because of it. Compared to my current indifference and ruthlessness, the Prime Minister's daughter in front of you is more like a cold-blooded executioner. Besides, when she ordered you and Mr. Philas to attack, I'm afraid she didn't consider your safety. You should be well aware of this." If you had attacked at that time, you would have been in enemy territory. If you had failed, it's not hard to imagine what kind of situation you would have faced. In fact, if you hadn't met me, I'm afraid you would have met with misfortune by now, Brando continued. Lorena was slightly stunned and could not help but fall silent. What a bandit's logic. Cruz's war with Erwin was just your own decision, my lord. But you can put it on my head and make me an executioner, my lord. Delphian was pressed into the chair and sneered. Brando looked at the woman with some pity and replied slowly, compared to a woman like you who has no normal human feelings, it is indeed difficult for you to understand the kinship and bonds between people. After all, these things are too complicated and profound for you. You have cold blood flowing in your veins, but I can declare war on Kurlutz for Freya's sake. That's the biggest difference between you and me, Delphian seemed to have been stabbed in the ribs. She could not help but bite her lower lip and stare at him viciously. Miss Delphian, I can endorse Count Tanagel's words and ensure that he is not an alarmist. Princess Griffin, who was watching silently from the side, suddenly interjected at this time. She replied quietly, Mr. Brando is right. This has nothing to do with reason or interest. The murderer must pay with his life. Erwin has the ability to protect its people. Brando turned his head. He looked at the princess with some gratitude. Although he knew that there was some element of buying people's hearts, at least she stood up and chose to stand with him in front of outsiders at this time. It meant that she would always be on his side in this matter. Not only Brando, but even Lorena and Filas could not help but look at the eldest princess of Erwin in surprise. Both of them looked surprised and subconsciously re-evaluated the count's position in the princess's heart. It was obvious that they were more intimate than the rumors outside said. Delphian stared coldly at Princess Griffin. She trembled slightly and replied in a venomous tone, I understand. But you'd better kill me. Otherwise, I swear that as long as you don't kill me one day, I will definitely make a move on the people around you. You won't have the chance, Miss Delphian, Brando replied coldly, I know what you're thinking, but I have a lot more brains than you think. At this point, he was too lazy to deal with this venomous woman anymore, so he turned back to her and said, Amandina, take her away. Everyone must be responsible for their own actions. Amandina nodded slightly, then led the accompanying soldiers to take the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Cruz Empire away. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 687. Delphian was unusually quiet as she was taken away, but she kept staring at him with eyes like a viper, which made Brando shudder a little. To be honest, if it weren't for his relationship with Veronica, he really would have put this woman to death. Anyway, a bad relationship with the Prime Minister of the Empire was inevitable, and he thought that Cruz's people might not really dare to declare war on Erwin over a woman. Lorena watched Delphian being taken away, and the female knight wanted to say something but couldn't for a moment. As an emissary of the Empire, it would naturally be disgruntled to be dealt with in this way, but the problem was that she didn't seem to have any right to be disgruntled. She thought for a long time before saying weakly, My lord, I hope you can carefully consider the way you get along with the Empire. Of course I understand, but it also depends on who it is. I naturally know the difference between friend and foe. I can only say that Lady Veronica chose the wrong person to complete the wrong mission this time. Brando replied. He gestured to the Shire, and Lorena and Filas, who were imprisoned in their chairs by magic, suddenly felt their bodies loosen. The female knight was still able to maintain her composure. But her fiancé couldn't help but let out a long sigh immediately, staring at Brando with a little fear. He had suffered a lot at the hands of the Prime Minister's daughter along the way because of his glib tongue, but he didn't expect such a terrifying woman to be locked up in the dark prison by this inhumane guy. He thought for a moment, and if it were him, he would certainly be reluctant to do so. Delphian's beauty was famous throughout the empire. Thinking of this, Philas couldn't help but look at Brando with some fear again. In his eyes, he had already decided that the other party was probably one of those legendary barbarians in the wilderness. No, he should be called a chieftain. No matter how beautiful a woman was, she was meaningless to such a boor, and in some knight novels, it was even mentioned that these barbarians seemed to prefer men. The young knight's thoughts diverged to this extent, and he couldn't help but take another look at the Shire, who had been controlling him and Lorena with magic, with a thoughtful look on his face. Of course, Brando didn't know that some strange thoughts were running through the mind of the famous idiot, and almost unbelievably lucky gigolo, in history in front of him. This title wasn't given to him, but the real title of Cruise's #1 lucky knight in history. First of all, he defeated many outstanding children from various noble families in Cruise, and married Lorena, Cruise's future's most talented beauty. Lorena's future achievements in Cruise could even stand shoulder to shoulder with Freya's in Erewhon, and because she had a higher starting point, her achievements far beyond that of Lorena's. If he remembered correctly, Lorena and Vahina later succeeded to the position of Azure Sky's Legion commander. This was enough to surprise people, but Philas's luck was more than that. Unlike all the other noble children who grew up in intrigue, this guy's process of inheriting the title could be said to be smooth sailing. As the only son of Prince Barano, there were no competitors, and even the lack of pressure from the collateral branches. Such a twisty road to the title could be said to be enough to make everyone around him green with envy. Later, our Mr. Knight participated in the Holy War at the call of His Majesty the Emperor, and then miraculously spent a considerable period of time in the front line of a hail of bullets without any war on the Eastern Front. After that, he inexplicably ushered in a series of incredible victories, and finally, his accumulated military achievements allowed him to ascend to the throne of the Imperial Legion commander. He was known as the Legion commander who was picked up. Later, as time passed, Mr. Philas had long been in power, and his story had long become the most legendary story among the bards. Now, the legendary couple in this legendary story was sitting in front of him. They, Lorena, was just a small knight captain under Veronica, and Philas was still an idle playboy. The journey of the two had not even begun, and he was more like a legendary figure in front of them. At least after the Battle of Ampere Seal, Brando's reputation in Cruise was not limited to just being a sword saint. Brando looked at the two people carefully. After a while, he picked up the envelope on the table again, glanced at it, and asked the female knight. "Lady Lorena, may I ask, when did the people of Cruise become aware of this?" Lorena looked at him, slightly startled, and realized what he was asking. She frowned and replied with a businesslike expression, 2 months ago, my lord." This question and answer was actually talking about the second matter mentioned in Veronica's letter to him. Compared to the first matter, which was neither painful nor itchy, the second matter was much trickier in Brando's opinion. Things had to start with the Battle of Ampere Seal. In that battle, Erewhon's people finally shattered the 3 doors of flame and sent the demons back to their hometown under the Sulphur River. Of course, Brando also experienced this part of the story himself. The demon army was defeated and fled in all directions, and then completely dispersed by the Silver Elves and the Highland Knight, as well as the craftsman mages who arrived later. But there was still a small number of them who survived and escaped into the wilderness of Erewhon. This small number caused a huge problem for the people of Cruise. Originally, the whole thing should have come to an end after Cruise's people were forced to completely retreat from the port of Ampere Seal for the sake of saving face. But perhaps no one would have thought that history would develop like this. About the month of the first lunar month, the monks from the Holy Cathedral of Fire found that the 3 doors of flame were missing to varying degrees after thoroughly cleaning up the battlefield. These missing doors of flame were quickly sent back to Cruise for the high-ranking priests to identify. Only half a month later, the news that the entire Holy Cathedral of Fire was shrouded in a nightmare was confirmed. The missing parts of the 3 doors of flame were almost enough to form a new portal. So it was obvious. In other words, there was at least one or more groups of demons, cave dwellers, cultists, or something similar from the underground of Jorgandi Ridge with these fragments and were preparing to do something bad in Erwin's territory. For the Holy Cathedral of Fire, this was simply a ridiculous joke. Or rather, it was a resounding slap to the face of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Even Brando couldn't help but be a little dumbfounded when he saw the news, let alone the others. Although it was an almost open secret that the Holy Cathedral of Fire was infiltrated by All for One, he didn't expect the other party to be so useless. It was no wonder that the power core of the Cruz Empire was leaning more and more towards the royal power day by day. In the face of such a useless enemy, it was difficult for Her Majesty the Silver Queen to not win. Brando thought silently for a moment, then shook the letter in his hand. Now he was almost certain that Veronica must be having trouble sleeping and eating at the moment. If possible, he was afraid that the army commander would rather not send this letter to him. The Cruz Empire had never been so humiliated in a century, and it was continuous humiliation. But the problem was that there was now a group of people who were wandering around with these fragments of the portal, and could find an energy core to rebuild the portal at any time. Veronica couldn't turn a blind eye to it. This was actually not a serious problem for Erwin. After all, if they could get rid of 3 portals, they could naturally get rid of an incomplete temporary portal. But it was a big problem for the Holy Cathedral of Fire, no matter when or where the portal was built by these cultists. Even if it was built in a random pigsty in Erwin's countryside, the Holy Cathedral of Fire would not be able to raise its head in front of the other major holy cathedrals for at least half a century. As for the Holy War, it might be better to just hang up the truce sign and hand over the benefits in their hands. Besides, the problem of face was secondary. Such an incident would be the biggest blow to the reputation of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and would inevitably cause many people's faith to waver. Brando never thought that the largest number of farmers and craftsmen among the believers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire would have strong faith, and once faith collapsed, it was difficult to rebuild. But this was not the biggest disaster. For the people of Cruz, the worst possibility was that these cultists would bring the fragments of the portal back to the Cruz Empire. For the sake of Martha, just imagining that scene would probably give the higher-ups of the Holy Cathedral of Fire nightmares at night. Not to mention that the demons would study and replicate these fragments. Although this possibility was very small, once it was successful, the higher-ups of the Holy Cathedral of Fire would probably have to atone for their sins with death. If it were not such a serious situation, perhaps the arrogant Green Sword Saint would not have hoped that he would prioritize protecting the Holy Cathedral of Fire. To be honest, as a person of Erwin, Brando was happy to see Cruz lose face, but Veronica's words actually meant that she hoped that he would help out on account of their past friendship. If one were to say who had the most real power in the southern part of Erwin, it would naturally be him and Her Royal Highness, who had the support of the Highland Knight, Duke Anthony, and the Southern Legion. That was why this letter was sent to him and Princess Griffine. Thinking of Veronica, Brando could not help but sigh. To be honest, the female commander of the Cruz Empire had left a good impression on him. Besides, there was also Vahina, and he knew that in private, the arrogant young lady actually regarded him as a friend. After you found out, the Azure Skies Legion immediately entered Erwin. He thought for a moment and asked again. No, in fact, it was a big shot of the Holy Cathedral of Fire who asked Lady Veronica for help. I don't know exactly who it was. Because this matter is so important, not many people even within the Empire know about it. Lorena replied. Brando could not help but shake his head. You also know that it is important, but the person who was sent as an envoy seems to be a bit lacking in consideration. The female knight was slightly startled and immediately showed a look of hesitation. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 688. What's the matter? Brando saw her expression. If you have something to say, you might as well say it, Miss Knight. I've heard of your reputation, so I won't equate you with someone else. Miss Delphian volunteered to go, and Lady Veronica didn't know about what happened between her and you. I only noticed it later by accident. I just didn't expect her to be so resolute. In fact, it's all my fault. I shouldn't have taken any chances with such an important matter. Lorena sighed and replied with a little self-blame. Brando was suddenly curious. How so? You know what's going on. He couldn't help but be curious. Anyone who was targeted by a crazy woman for no reason would feel creeped out. In fact, he still felt very uncomfortable when he thought of Delphian's resentful eyes. It felt as if he had done something unforgivable to her, but for Marcia's sake, there was nothing between him and her. Brando remembered clearly that he had only met her from afar when he was at the front line against the calamity of wolves in the Black Forest. Actually, it's like this. Lorena was also a little embarrassed when it came to this matter. She sorted out her thoughts and then told him about Delphian in detail. Although Viscount Elman died at the hands of Andesha, Miss Delphian has always thought that you deliberately left them behind. Plus, she has always been in love with Viscount Elman, which is well known in the Empire. The Viscount's death was a great blow to Miss Delphian. This is really an unexpected disaster, Lady Lorena. Brando smiled bitterly. After listening to this ridiculous story, he suddenly felt a little speechless. This was a disaster from the heavens. If he had known that he would offend such a paranoid lady, he would have carefully sent Viscount Elman out of the country. He would never have given Andesha a chance to take advantage of him. I'm sorry, my lord. Miss Delphian, she. Lorena seemed to want to further plead for the Prime Minister's daughter. But Brando interrupted her first. I understand what you mean, Miss Lorena. But even so, she shouldn't have attacked innocent people. This isn't revenge, it's just venting her anger. He thought for a moment and added, I will consider your words, but not now. It's better to let that young lady calm down. You don't want her to ruin Lady Veronica's plan, do you? Lorena was startled, and then it occurred to her that this was indeed a possibility. According to Delphian's current mentality, as long as she could get revenge, she wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice the Empire. After thinking for a moment, she couldn't help but sigh, I understand. Then let's continue. Brando replied, since not many people in the Empire know about your operation this time, then there shouldn't be many people from Azure Skies, right? May I know how many people you have? This. I'm sorry, this is confidential, Count. Lorena was a little embarrassed, but she still refused Brando's question. It's okay, I was just asking casually. Brando narrowed his eyes. In fact, he could already be sure that the Azure Skies that sneaked into Erewhon might only be a small elite group. As mentioned in the information he received, it might be an elite knight regiment under the Azure Skies. But there was no need to delve into this matter. He asked again, the letter says that the Holy Cathedral of Fire suspects that the fragments may be with Grand Duke Erech. Is this true? The female knight nodded and said, yes, since entering Erewhon, Lady Veronica has received information that matches this speculation. Maybe it was Grand Duke Erech who colluded with the cultists and demons to steal the fragments of the portal that day. I heard that Grand Duke Erech and Count Randner have recently formed an alliance, which means that this batch of fragments may have been transported to Magedon. It's possible. Lorena frowned. But the news from the Holy Cathedral of Fire indicates that the fragments may not have stayed in Magedon, but moved north. Do you have a way to track the location of those fragments? Brando was stunned. He looked back at the female knight, thinking that these cruise people weren't here to make fun of him. If they had the ability to locate those fragments, why would they need him? But Lorena's answer immediately answered the question in his heart, no, it's just some trivial divination and prophecies, my lord. Brando then realized, then north, where north? He suddenly asked. This. The female knight was speechless. How could she know such a thing? But her naturally serious personality still made her reply, "I'm sorry, I don't know either." But she didn't expect Brando to interrupt her and say, "It's okay, maybe I know." He looked back and his eyes fell on the point marked with the name Magedon on the huge map. From here to the north, it was the vast misty forest, and further north into Lantern Island. His eyes moved up quickly, the answer of forest, the Goldfinch Mountains, the mountains on the north shore of Lake Valendon. A bolt of lightning flashed through his mind, as if bringing with it a fire seed called wisdom. He suddenly raised his head and realized what these demons, or cultists, or Grand Duke Erek wanted to do. To rebuild a portal, first of all, a lot of magic power must be needed. Preferably an energy core. The crew's people had fired gems. Then what about Grand Duke Erek? Brando's gaze finally stopped. There, on the map, was a line of fine text marked in rough font, Falling Needle Hills Avenue. Falling Needle Hills Avenue, Stained Frost Forest Maze, Heart of the Dragon. Your Highness. As soon as Brando walked out of the hall, he found Princess Griffin standing outside the porch. The half-elf girl stood by the stone window, looking out at the hills in the direction of the Gars River beach. After a moment of surprise, he immediately bowed his head and saluted. The princess turned around. She seemed to have been waiting for him here for a long time. After looking at him quietly, she asked slowly, "Your Excellency, how should we deal with the relationship with the Kralutzians next? Are we going to help them this time?" "This time we must help, Your Highness," Brando answered truthfully. "Ha!" Princess Griffin looked back with a little surprise. "Why? I remember you don't like them very much." "Actually, I already have some ideas." Falern followed Brando out of the hall and let Brando take the coat and cloak from her. Brando looked out of the window. The undulating ridge line was covered by a green forest, and above it were snow-like clouds and blue skyline. He looked at the flock of migratory birds flying away and said, "Now is a good opportunity to persuade Grand Duke Viro to join our side. If we're lucky," he added, "we might be able to get Grimoires to join us." Griffin was not stupid. On the contrary, her wisdom was one of the best among the royal family members of Erwin's generation. Of course, she could understand Brando's meaning, but the girl looked at the cloak in Brando's hand and asked curiously, "Your Highness, where are you going?" In her memory, although the young man in front of her had become a count, he had never cared about his appearance. If he was not going out, he would rarely wear a coat, let alone a cloak or shawl. Therefore, she was keenly aware of this from Brando's subtle movements. Brando did not intend to hide it. He nodded and said, "I suddenly have an idea." "An idea?" "Yes," Brando replied, "it seems that Lady Martha is still on our side this time. If all goes well, Princess Magedon will be able to wake up." Princess Griffin was stunned for a moment, then her silver eyes revealed a look of extreme joy. She did not even bother to maintain her composure as she blurted out, "Really? When have I ever lied to you, Your Highness?" Brando was also very happy, as if the problems that had been troubling him for the past few days were all solved in an instant. He had to admit that Duke Erek and Count Randner had given him a big gift this time. In fact, he had already discussed it with Bosley and Amandina. To wake Magedon up was easy, but also difficult. The nun princess was not human. Her injuries were in fact caused by the destruction of the mana source that drove and maintained her body functions. Alaz herself had also indirectly confirmed this. To restore the mana source, the easiest way was to replace it with a new one. There was only one person in the territory who had mastered this technique. Brando had not forgotten that Alaz had put the Titan's core into his body. However, finding a new mana core was a problem. But Duke Erek's current movements immediately gave him an answer. Because he had been busy participating in and planning Erwin's civil war, he had almost forgotten that he was once a player. The Falling Needle Hill's main path, the Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth Instance Dungeon, just so happened to have the most suitable mana source. The Heart of the Dragon. Duke Arek obviously went there for this thing, although Brando did not know how this guy knew about the existence of the Heart of the Dragon. But what he had to do now was obviously to find this treasure before the other party. Also, if those idiots really did build a portal there, he would not hesitate to destroy it. This way, not only would he be able to complete Veronica's mission, but he would also be able to clear up a lot of things here. For Brando, there was nothing more practical than this gift. Seeing the confident look on his face, Princess Griffin took a light breath and asked cautiously, "Are you going now?" "No," Brando shook his head. "Before that, I have to take care of something first." "What is it?" Brando grinned and replied, "Private matter. P.S. Today's third watch is 10,000. In addition, I strongly recommend the novel by the Roaring Lord Wind and Moon, Heaven's Drive. The book number is 024932250. The unscrupulous introduction is as follows. This book has all kinds of cute points that are enough to attract you. Original introduction. Who knows how many people's bones have to be stepped on to reach the peak of this world? Well, this is actually a story of a young man leading his sister and Lolita on the road of Magneto, leading the vast number of ability users to become rich and prosperous, and to a better future, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 690. Brando, where are we going? The metal parts on the two warhorses rattled as they moved through the forest one after the other. The female knight on the horse held the reins tightly with one hand and turned her head to look at the surrounding scenery worriedly. The still forest was like an oil painting, with refreshing greenery seeping out from the depths of the background. Sunlight passed through the canopy and scattered on the withered leaves like a curtain of light. The forest was silent, except for the rustling of the horse's hooves on the withered leaves and the sound of metal colliding, which made one's hair stand on end. Freya's face was a little pale. Although she had only suffered minor injuries at the hands of Lorena and was fine after Muriel's treatment. But the long journey on horseback after losing blood was still a little too much for her. Tired? Brando looked back at her and asked with concern. No, but it's getting dark. If we go any further, we won't be able to return to Schaflund. Freya said with a worried tone. She didn't know why Brando suddenly asked her to go to Schaflund and go deep into Mount Greyhar. A little further ahead was the Black Forest. It's okay, Brando smiled on horseback and didn't seem to care. When it gets dark, we can camp in the wild. With me here, what are you worried about? But Freya's face turned red. But we only have one tent. Brando liked the future Valkyrie like this, so he wasn't in a hurry to answer. When the latter glared at him fiercely, he laughed. Actually, I was lying to you. We'll be there soon. Freya breathed a sigh of relief and then realized that she had been teased. She took a deep breath and resisted the urge to punch the smirking face with difficulty. But she saw that the latter had already tightened the reins and let out a soft sigh, and the warhorse under him stopped. Brando looked around carefully, as if to confirm something. Then, he dismounted from the horse with a whoosh. With one hand on the hilt of his sword, he dragged his cloak and slowly walked forward. Seeing Brando like this, Freya had no choice but to put away her original angry expression and became curious. She saw him rustling the dead leaves as he walked to a tree. Of course, she did not recognize the scientific names of the trees on the labels in the thick literature of scholars. However, she knew that the giant trees with dark trunks were commonly known as ghost trees in Erewhon. Brando, what are you looking at? Brando raised his head and looked at the ebony tree. He was very familiar with these trees, as if he had seen them again after many years of separation. There was a faint sense of intimacy. He thought of something in silence, of all the past, some of which he could not remember clearly, but the memories still flashed through his mind like shards of glittering fragments, like seashells in a sea of sand. Then, he looked away and found the grayish-white boulder not far from where he remembered. The boulder was like a giant egg stuck in the ground at an angle. His eyes followed the uneven surface of the boulder, and he stopped every time he went up. After the third time, he saw the forked star-shaped crack. Then, he replied, "Nothing. We're here, Freya. We're here." Freya could not help but raise her head and look around. After half of the afternoon, the light in the forest grew dimmer and dimmer. She could only see an empty space made up of dark green treetops, twisted tree trunks, and intertwined roots. From this angle, the forest looked more like a semi-enclosed cave with intersecting tunnels leading in all directions. Unlike the other places in Tonajol, the black coniferous forests that were commonly seen in Grimoires and Ranner Mountains were rarely seen. Instead, it was covered with large patches of evergreen broad-leaved forests, as if there was a mysterious magic that nourished this ancient forest underground. What is this place? This should be the border of the Black Forest in this direction. Brando took a few steps forward and pushed aside a large patch of shrubs. He noticed that they were almost at the top of the mountain. Looking to the east, there were black ridges that went from south to north, like the backs of several dragons. He stretched out his hand and pointed in that direction and said, "To the east is the Eversong Forest. You should have heard of it, right? The mountains of Chablis." Freya asked curiously. The mountains of Chablis were a famous landmark in the southern part of Erewhon. The beautiful scenery of the Eversong Forest had always been a tourist destination, so she had heard of it even when she was in Butchie. Yes, Brando nodded, but to be more precise, it should be the border between Tosancade Forest and the Eversong Forest. The Tusk Fortress is located in that direction, and it's the southern border of Erewhon. After saying that, he stared in that direction without saying a word. Surrounded by clouds and mist was a vast wilderness. The dark forest was scattered all over the place, and it was a rare sight for explorers. Any player who saw such a scene would be filled with ambition, just like a sailor trying to conquer the magnificent sea. But why did we come here? Boo, Brando, what are you doing? The Night Maiden was puzzled. She did not understand why Brando would bring her to such a desolate place. But when she saw Brando taking off his cloak and coat, she was startled. She subconsciously placed her hand on the hilt of her sword and stared at him nervously. Brando stopped and looked at the future goddess of war in confusion. "What are you thinking about? Why are you taking off your clothes?" "Of course I'm going to climb down from here." "What are you thinking?" Brando replied snappily, "Am I not worthy of your trust? Come and help me get my clothes. Wait here for me, idiot." Freya's face turned as red as blood. She lowered her head as if she wanted to find a hole to hide in. But when she heard Brando's request, the goddess of war dilly-dallied for a long time before she unbuckled all kinds of leather buckles and climbed down from the horse. If she dismounted at this speed in the academy, she would probably get a negative score in the riding test. Then she took the coat from Brando with trembling hands. Where are you going?" She held the coat in a daze and asked gingerly like a clumsy maid. "You'll know later," Brando replied. Then she looked up and saw him walking to the side. He pulled out a rope from the bag on the horse and tied it to the ghost tree from before. She saw him let go of the rope little by little and slowly walk to the edge of the cliff. Then he looked down and threw the other half of the rope down. "Brando, what's down there?" The goddess of war was slightly stunned and finally realized what Brando was going to do. Brando raised his head and looked at her from that direction. He put a finger to his lips and shook his head at the girl from the countryside of Butchie. Then he grabbed the rope with one hand and suddenly jumped down. "Be careful!" Freya could not help but shout in a low voice. But the shout seemed to be dragged further and further away from his ears. The biting cold wind above the cliff made him squint his eyes, and when he finally managed to distinguish the scenery in front of him, he felt that the fog below the cliff was very close to him, just like the illusion of being close to the surface of the water when he jumped into the water. Then, with a whoosh, he felt himself falling into the clouds. Brando hurriedly grabbed some ropes. With his strength as a gold ranker, he naturally did not need to climb down the rope bit by bit. But the last time he came here was at least 10 years ago, and nearly 100 years had passed in the game. He was afraid that he remembered the wrong location, so he brought the rope for insurance. After all, before he really activated his elemental activation, he could not fly in the sky. Brando stared at the cliff. In just a few seconds, a platform protruding out of the bushes swept past his sight. His reaction was quick. He clenched his fist, and the rope in his hand immediately tightened with a bang. The strong reaction force pulled him back and forth in the air. There was a burnt smell on the rope, but he did not feel anything strange in his hand. The physical fitness of a gold ranker had long exceeded the range of what a normal person could imagine. He raised his head and looked up. The location of the platform was not much different from what he remembered. It was more than 10 meters away from him. But this distance was almost non-existent to him. Brando gently swung the rope close to the cliff, then grabbed the jagged rocks and climbed up lightly like a monkey. The platform covered with bushes was almost exactly the same as what he remembered. Brando looked around. The rock that protruded from the mountainside was about half the size of a basketball court. But in fact, it was much wider, but the dense trees and vines blocked most of his sight. He carefully walked in a direction according to his memory, then pulled away the thick entangled vines. With a crash, accompanied by the sound of soil rolling down, Brando did not use much strength to pull away the dead branches and rotten leaves. Sure enough, a cone-shaped stone slab was revealed below. This stone slab was about his height and 2 people wide. It was a bit like the stone statue of wisdom, one that was commonly seen in forests everywhere, but it was not the image of Misokai, the weaver of magic and storm, but a black moon. The silent moon, Eruin's 7th moon. This moonless moon could never be observed from the sky, but it really existed in history. Brando did not say a word. He cleaned up the vines on the platform one by one, and then revealed another 11 similar stone tablets below. On each stone tablet, there was a moon, which in turn represented the flowing fate and the source of magic in Eruin's sky. This place was the Temple of Fate. Or rather, it was where the players called it the Class Change Center. Brando had once checked the information. These stone tablets were built by a race even older than the Myernas. The purpose of their construction seemed to be to stabilize the original Martha's Law of Tiamat. In the whole of Wonde, such stone tablets existed in many places, but they were all built in extremely hidden places. For example, the one in Tonajul was built on the border of the Black Forest in Mount Greyhar and had been buried for countless years. However, when Brando went to these places in the game, these stone tablets had already been cleaned up by the players in front of him, so he did not have to waste so much time on them like today. He carefully looked at the thin veins on the ground in the center of the stone tablet array, then raised his head, and his gaze followed them to the center of the platform. These rune lines and veins with a metallic glow were very familiar to him. They were very similar to the energy transmission magic circles he saw under Valhalla, as if they were made by the same civilization. This doubt flashed through Brando's mind. Then he put away his thoughts and walked to the center of the platform. Although these stone tablets in Wonde contained all kinds of secrets, they only had one function in the game. That was to let the players receive their own elemental activation missions. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 691. In fact, after leaving Ampere Seal, the elemental activation quest had been put on Brando's agenda. Because since entering the elemental activation stage, all his experience bars had been locked into gray. Such a state in the Amber Sword meant that players had to unlock the elemental activation quest before they could further level up. But that was only one of the reasons. The real reason why he came here was because of the information he got from Lorena. The Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth was extremely famous in Erewhon in the past game, whether it was the labyrinth itself or the famous Winter Dragon in the labyrinth. This dungeon was one of the few legendary dungeons in Erewhon, and the so-called legendary dungeons themselves were dungeons that allowed guild-level teams of hundreds of people to enter. Before the release of the third version, there was only one such dungeon in each civilized area, one, outside of the Black Forest. It represented the highest honor of a team challenge in the earlier era in Brando's memory, so the difficulty of the dungeon was imaginable. Although Brando had long expected to meet the young dragon on the Falling Needle Hills Avenue, he didn't expect the opportunity to descend in front of him so soon. To be honest, if it weren't for the fear that a wreck would really get the heart of the dragon in front of him, he really didn't want to go to the Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth so early. The Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth itself was a black forest in a civilized land, and it was almost of the highest level, a place where the laws were tilted. Or rather, the Twilight Scar, an existence similar to the Saint's Legacy and the Fairy Village, which were diametrically opposed to the Order. As a player of Erewhon, Brando was naturally very familiar with this dungeon. The existence of the Stained Frost Forest started in the era of the Twilight Battle. After the fall of Babel Fortress, the Frostweaver Milos fled south with the Myrnas. After 7 days and 7 nights of pursuit, the Alpha Wolfakis caught up with the giant god at the border of the Winter Kingdom, and then an earth-shattering battle broke out. It was written in the Pale poem, Ekis bit Milos' neck, and the giant father was torn apart. Its huge body seemed to turn into a brilliant star, falling to the east, north, and south. The place where the giant star fell to the ground immediately ignited a raging flame, but the flame had no temperature, but a rising ice flame. Legend had it that a fragment of the giant god Milos fell to the south and landed in present-day Viro, forming the eternal frozen Black Forest. Even if it was located in the central area of Marsh's blessed land, it could not be assimilated for a long time. In fact, in the game, the Stained Frost Forest was almost the source of all the monsters and players' quests in Viro. Although Brando had a lot of friends in his previous life, he didn't join any large guilds before the fall of Erewhon. It was nothing more than a small group with a few seniors. A team like theirs naturally had no fate with a legendary dungeon like the Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth, but even so, they still experienced the perverted nature of this dungeon in the periphery. In his memory, it was when the dungeon was first opened. All the players of Erewhon went to experience it, and their team was no exception. However, just like most players, a party like theirs had bumped into a huge obstacle before they even entered the dungeon. That was the baby dragon. The door god with the bloodline of the Golden Folk. Because it liked the cold climate, it entrenched itself near the Stained Frost Forest and blocked all players who tried to enter the forest. To be honest, it was difficult for the average player to imagine the power of the Dragon Clan before that. And the game designer gave all players a chance to accumulate experience in this event. The so-called baby dragon. In fact, Brando also understood that Alaz was a ready-made example. Let the players of that era, or even most of the players who had not yet elemental activation, have to face a little female dragon, the consequences could be imagined. Brando didn't even want to recall the details of the battle because there were no details to speak of. To put it simply, we came, we saw, and we fell. And this was just the old man guarding the door. Because of this, Brando urgently needed to activate his elemental activation first. Although the legendary dungeon represented the peak of team dungeon difficulty in an era, it had its limitations after all. Once the elemental activation was completed, the difficulty of the dungeon would naturally decrease geometrically. After all, it was a dungeon before elemental activation, and the design idea also had its limitations. While thinking about these trivial things, Brando walked to the center of the stone tablet array. In theory, once a player in the game walked to the center of the stone array, the quest system would immediately activate. Just like when he was in the Eternal Song Forest and the Forbidden Orchard, he immediately received a system prompt. But what made Brando slightly startled was that he waited for a little while. Except for the whistling wind in the mountains, the surroundings were silent. What's going on? Brando's heart began to panic. In theory, he had already touched the elemental wall. If he was an indigenous person, he should have already activated his elemental activation without even needing a quest. Because for the indigenous people, elemental activation was almost synonymous with elemental activation, and the rest was just the accumulation of attributes and experience. But to say that his attributes should have already been enough, or even exceeded it. And his experience had already been locked. This should be a sign of preparing to unlock the elemental activation quest in any way. But the problem was, he had never heard of a player who could not receive a quest in the stone array after meeting all the conditions. Moreover, there was no second way to obtain the elemental activation quest in the game. The cold wind in the mountains blew, and in just a moment, Brando's forehead was already covered in cold sweat. Many possibilities flashed through his mind for a moment, the most terrifying of which was undoubtedly that as a transmigrator, he might not be able to activate his elemental activation at all. At the thought of this, even with Brando's current psychological quality, he could not help but turn a little pale. If he could not activate his elemental activation and continue to level up, his dream of saving this kingdom and setting history on a different path would be nothing more than a bubble. In this world, no matter the situation, strength was first and foremost. But he closed his eyes and took a gentle breath to calm himself down. Although this possibility could not be ruled out, it seemed unlikely. Because if a soul from another world was incompatible with the laws of this world, then he might not have been able to come into contact with any elemental power before. But he already had a part of the elemental power, didn't he? Brando stood there blankly for a moment, then suddenly remembered something. He hurriedly opened his character panel, but all the attributes on the character panel were the same. He frowned and flipped through the pages. Suddenly, his eyes lit up slightly. His gaze stopped on the character log. At the bottom of the log, there was a line of small green text, Authority unlocking conditions not met. Authority unlocking conditions not met. Brando saw this line of text and froze for a moment. What kind of hint was this? Authority unlocking conditions not met. He knew very well that all his conditions should have met the criteria for elemental activation. There was no way that the unlocking conditions were not met. What the hell is going on? Brando couldn't help but frown. Could this be the legendary bug? However, this question seemed a bit ridiculous. Not to mention that the chances of encountering a bug in the Amber Sword were almost lower than being struck by lightning. And even if he encountered a bug now, where would he go to find the game manager to solve the problem? Brando couldn't help but feel a headache when he thought of this problem. He couldn't help but knock on his head and began to calculate the differences between himself and the average player. The biggest difference was nothing more than two. One was his own elite template, and the other was the Planeswalker system. But the elite template also existed in the game, and it didn't seem to have much to do with the elemental power and the laws themselves. He first ruled out this possibility, but the remaining Planeswalker system gave him a headache. To be honest, although the Planeswalker system had always been his biggest reliance, he had never figured out the thing itself. How did it come about? Did it also exist in the game? What was the principle of its operation? Brando only learned a few words of information from Tumen, the Stag Banshee, and Saint Tassol. Although part of this information explained the history and origin of the Planeswalker, to be honest, the three of them probably didn't know where the Planeswalker came from. Not to mention figuring out the principle of its existence. He thought for a while but couldn't figure it out. But when he thought of the name Saint Tassol, he finally remembered that there was another existence in his body that knew about the planeswalker just like him. He hurriedly called out in his heart, "Lord Saint Tassol." Woo 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 woo. A confused voice was heard. The voice seemed to hesitate for a moment, then suddenly became clear. "Brando. Didn't I say I need to catch up on sleep at this time every day?" There was a hint of sternness in the voice. Brando hurriedly coughed. The legendary great sage was not a good-tempered existence, especially when this elf had repeatedly warned him not to disturb her to catch up on sleep. According to her own words, lack of sleep was the #1 enemy of beauty. But with Martha above, the heroic spirit didn't seem to need to care about this. Of course, he wouldn't unwisely say this out loud. He could only smile and say, "Lord Saint Tassol, I have encountered a little trouble." Little trouble? The Wind Empress' voice was startled. She had accompanied Brando for a long time, and she rarely heard him talk about his troubles. She pondered for a moment and asked, "Is it about the planeswalker?" Brando was really shocked by this elf. "How did you know?" "Humph," the Wind Empress lightly snorted, "you are a freak. You have a lot of knowledge that even I don't know. It seems that the only thing that can confuse you is the inheritance of the planeswalker." She paused for a moment and continued, "Tell me, what trouble have you encountered?" Brando hurriedly explained his predicament. Of course, he skipped the part about the elemental activation task. After all, it was really difficult to explain. It was like trying to explain to the Shire what a cabbage that didn't exist in this world was. He changed to a more euphemistic way and told the Wind Empress that he had encountered a little trouble on the road to elemental activation. "You mean, you can't touch the elemental wall, maybe because you are a planeswalker?" The Wind Empress quickly listened to Brando's explanation, but immediately asked, "Why haven't I heard of the Darkness Dragon Odin having this problem?" "How would I know?" Brando spread his hands helplessly. "Wait. The elf seemed to have caught the center of gravity. Do you have your own deck?" This. Brando thought for a moment and replied seriously, "I think I have one." "Then you're really an idiot." Saint Tassol suddenly asked fiercely, "Brando, you woke me up for such a stupid thing. I thought you were a smart guy." "Wait," Brando reacted at this time, "Wind Empress, what do you mean?" "You mean, if I want elemental activation, I have to have my own deck of cards." "Nonsense." The Elf Empress used her unique charming voice and concisely ended the discussion with Brando. "To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 692. Elemental energy is a law. If you can't control your own power, how can you reach the realm of elemental energy? To put it simply, you have to be at least an official planeswalker to continue on this path. I was already curious. Brando, you've only been using other people's cards. At best, you're an apprentice. How can you reach the level of elemental energy? Saint Tassol looked at him doubtfully. A possibility flashed through Brando's mind. It might be because he had two souls in one body. As one half of Sophie had inherited the legacy of a planeswalker, and the other half of Brando had inherited the bloodline of the Darkness Dragon. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. His thick eyebrows couldn't help but raise. "Then, what should I do?" he asked, Lady Saint Tassol. "How would I know? I'm not a planeswalker." The elven lady shrugged and glared at Brando, "But you, as an apprentice of a planeswalker, why do you always act like a dabbler? Do all planeswalkers teach their apprentices like this? No wonder there are fewer and fewer inheritors of this legacy." Brando didn't know whether to laugh or cry. When he first opened the elemental pool, Tumen only told him the origin of this legacy and the history of how the Matatanians used this ability. Now that he thought about it, time was tight at the time. The Elemental Emperor might have only taught him a rudimentary skill to deal with Turst's pursuit. After all, he had to be alive to have the possibility of learning future knowledge. Later, in Kelsey's tomb, the dear Demoness taught him advanced combat skills. Although she also talked about the importance of pursuing one's own power, she didn't go into too much detail. In the end, it seemed that the Wind Empress wasn't wrong. On the path of a planeswalker, he looked like a dabbler no matter how he looked at it. But Brando thought for a moment and said, "Well, actually I'm not completely clueless, yes. Tumen once told me, perfecting the rules of the world begins with the creation of your own basic deck. He said, actually, from the moment you come into contact with the first card of fate, you have already revealed your own deck. My deck is Tyrant of all classes." Brando said the term awkwardly. Fortunately, the Wind Empress did not notice it at all. She only looked at Brando with a deep gaze. "So your inheritance came from that guy," Brando nodded. "It seems that I have misinterpreted his meaning. I opened the path of a knight from the very beginning, but after that, I didn't continue on this path. Instead, I blindly enriched the world. Are you able to recognize that now?" The Wind Empress raised her eyebrows slightly. "It seems that you should have noticed something after I used that shameless woman to talk to you, right?" Brando was sweating profusely. Of course, he knew that the shameless woman Saint Tossel was talking about was the dear Demoness Elaine. He coughed and said, "More or less, so I have a rough idea of how to become an official planeswalker." "What do you plan to do?" Saint Tossel asked. Brando was silent for a moment. Although this was a decision he had made long ago during the Battle of Ampere Seal, when it really came down to it, he was still a little unwilling. After all, it was a very painful thing to give up the power that he had already obtained. But one path could lead to the highest peak, and the other path had already reached the peak. Brando knew what he should choose. "I think, now I want to go back to the original path. I want to become an apprentice again, and then form my own law." "I see." The Wind Empress had a slightly appreciative look in her eyes. "It seems that you are still the Brando I know. You have not been blinded by power." She paused and asked, "So, do you plan to do it now?" "Of course, Freya is still waiting for me up there." Brando replied, and then he waved his hand. At that moment, it was as if a world as deep as the universe had formed behind him. This scene was exactly the same as when Brando met Tumen that day, but his world was far less stable and vast than the Elemental Emperor's. It was as if it could envelop the entire world. Countless colorful lights flew out from this world. Silver Card, Unicorn Knight, Metasha. Highland Mage, the Shire. Holy Archangel. Sun Blade. Golden Battle Flag. One by one, the cards that belonged to him appeared in front of him. They were arranged in an orderly manner like stars. And further away, in Castle Abes, in the Gars River, in the forests of Port Gris and the Maxon area, the apprentices in the Mage Tower suddenly realized that the Shire on the podium had disappeared without a trace. The tree elves who were talking to their commander lost sight of the Silver Fairy Princess in the next moment. Mephistopheles realized that Enrich in front of him was turning into nothingness. As soon as he stood up, he disappeared with the vampire's daughter in front of everyone's eyes. And everywhere in Abes, the mercenaries of Lopez became transparent one by one. They looked at each other, and then seemed to melt under the sun. Echelonious spellweavers, glorious trumpeters, Fireclaw lizard men, the contractors who responded to Brando's summons gathered in front of Brando at the same time. Brando looked at them one by one. The Shire and Metasha, although they were on the cards, they were so lifelike that it was as if they could feel his gaze. And behind Brando, a small world formed by the sacred tree's secret grounds, the market of the Shire of Roe, the Ruggen Swamp, the Ember Volcano, and the Storm Nest were floating in the void. This small world seemed to represent all of Brando's power. Saint Tossol, the Wind Empress, looked at this scene silently. She couldn't help but sigh in her heart. This was the power of a planeswalker. Even though he was just an apprentice, he had already mastered the core rules of this world, having his own world. And going one step further, they would truly become the masters of the world. Sometimes, she didn't understand why there were planeswalkers in this world. They seemed to be outside of Martha's rules, but they didn't attract the attack of Martha's Tiamat law. Their identities and origins were an eternal mystery. What was the meaning of their existence? She squinted at all of this. But Brando had already made his final preparations. He waved his hand. The small world shattered with a bang. He frowned slightly. It was as if he could see his elemental pool collapsing into nothingness. The power of countless elements mixed together and converged into a point, as if it was the center of the universe. But in the darkest depths, energy, time, and space converged into a point, nurturing infinite power. All of the cards scattered in the air like trash. My lord, quickly stabilize your power. You can't control us anymore. Medish's voice came from the air. My lord, stay calm. This was the Shire's words. I believe in you. Brando nodded. He stretched out his hands, and the deep space behind him seemed to be expanding infinitely, forming a universe that was being nurtured anew. He said calmly, I rule that this law will be born from this. The glorious knight trekked through the wilderness of Labusa with a bugle flag in his hand. The wind and dust didn't stain his determined face. His will was as tough as a blade. This is the Knight of Fran, glorifying him and his followers with holy power. He should first have a territory. Brando said. The Shire's market fell into his hands like gold falling from the sky. It fell into the dark universe and immediately formed a prosperous land. Plants grew luxuriantly on the golden soil. First, meadows grew out of the soil, then trees grew branches, and in the blink of an eye, green trees grew into shade. Then the migrating travelers came, and humans cut down trees to build a city. In the blink of an eye, a small town full of traffic appeared in front of Brando and Saint Tossol. Then the gem plain formed a rich land in front of the town. The water gurgled, as if it could bring wealth from the distant sky. The nest of storms formed the background, and the distant mountains stretched. This scene seemed familiar, but it was particularly different for Brando. Presumably, with the power given to him by Tumen, he had finally arrived at the call of the power of the law. It wasn't a world created by the Planeswalker himself. It was Martha's approval. Brendel's heart trembled. What he said was Fran's knight. His favorite knight in the Amber Sword was different from other knights who were either good at defense or good at offense. Fran's knight had a balanced ability to attack, retreat, and defend. He also had divine abilities. He wasn't as fast as a warrior or as strong as a priest, but he perfectly embodied the profession of knight. Fran's knight shared glory with his followers. He first set the market of the Shire's Shire, the Gem Plain, and the Nest of Storms as the source of the knight's power, and then continued, he should have followers. Followers, this was the core ability of Fran's knight. Fran's knight gained the ability to summon at level 15, allowing him to summon a team of followers on the battlefield. Whenever the Fran's knight leveled up, these followers also leveled up. Fran's knight wasn't good at offense, but as a standard aura and command role, he was very good at teamwork. Brando looked up. A card was then drawn. The Mercenaries of Lopez. But this familiar card completely changed in Brando's eyes. First of all, it became a silver rare grade card, and its attributes were also greatly changed. Other than the familiar pattern, even the name had been completely changed. White City Vanguard Eversong I win 5, spell instant, pay 20 mana, night, the Franz Knight issued a call and placed a team of 12 mercenaries of Lopez into the field. Maintained, the mercenaries of Lopez, weight derivative equivalent to Franz Knight level -10, will be maintained until the next day's reset. Since the 172nd year of the First Era, the mercenaries of Lopez have been known for their bravery and outstanding loyalty. Although this card was chosen by Brando himself, when he saw this card, he couldn't help but blurt out. He stared at the pattern on the card. The images of the Nightsong Tiger and Falerne sisters were very clear, but this card was obviously no longer the mercenaries of Lopez. What's going on? Brando never dreamed that a card that originally belonged to the City-States Alliance would inexplicably be added to Eversong. Moreover, the cost was greatly reduced, but it became a summoning magic card. He was slightly startled, and at the same time, he suddenly heard Saint Ossoul's voice in his heart. At that moment, Brando also felt the fluctuation of energy at the same time. Both of them raised their heads at the same time. A 7-colored light suddenly shook in front of Brando, and a light door opened from it. This scene was familiar. Brando was about to call out that name, but a man in a silver robe had already walked out from behind the door. I said, "We will meet again. When you officially become a planeswalker." Brando. Tumen. Before Brando could even open his mouth, the Wind Empress had already called out. P.S. The 7th day. A champion who updates 10,000 times a day. Also, continue to ask for attention on Weibo. Asking for fans. Eternal Flame FF. This is my Weibo ID. I recommend Fathead Fish's book. The last time I called him Dumbhead Fish, he was not satisfied. Okay, actually this guy's real name is Yongtai 6 Britannia. No, it's Silver Ash Frost. Actually, it's almost the same, anyway, it's the same Chinibu. The title of the book is Heart Hunting King's Power. It complements the author's ID. Book number 2268766's introduction was too poorly written, so I decided to help him write a new one. This book tells the story of a Marxist materialist and a group of capitalist mages fighting a battle of wits and courage. Okay, that's Kyuso. Those who like psionic war mages can read this book. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 693. Before Brando could stop her, Saint Ossoul the Wind Empress had already left the ring on his hand. It was as if a shadow had materialized beside him. As soon as she landed on the ground, she stared at the young man with black hair and red eyes who walked out from behind the door of light. She called out his name with certainty. Tumen. Tumen paused. Saint Ossoul. The young man in his silver robe's red eyes suddenly lit up. Heroic spirit. The Moon Legacy. You also chose this little guy. It seems that my taste is not bad. Saint Ossoul's slender brows furrowed slightly. She stared at the figure in front of her suspiciously. Tumen, you're not dead. Tumen smiled and spread his hands. My student, 1,000 years have passed. When we meet again after 1,000 years, is this still the first thing you care about? Brando stood aside and watched this scene. Historically, Tumen was a follower of the Darkness Dragon and had a relationship with the Four Sages. But according to historical records, Saint Ossoul was indeed his student. Before the War of the Holy Saints, Tumen had taught the secrets of magic to all intelligent creatures and left precious knowledge like the sacred pattern. Seriously speaking, Gretel, Saint Ossoul, and Fanzon of the Four Sages had a teacher-student relationship with Tumen. But Saint Ossoul did not recognize this teacher. She looked at him coldly. In my opinion, this is not boring at all. Tumen, we worked so hard 1,000 years ago to achieve everything. I don't want to start all over again. Tumen smiled indifferently. My student, for 1,000 years, Gretel built the Crew's empire on the Great Plains. How is his holy cathedral of fire today? What is the difference between the Crew's people today and the Erewhon people of the past? You built the holy cathedral of the Wind Empress, but your subordinates turned around and betrayed you. Where are the once glorious mist elves today? Among all of you, I admire Fanzon the most. But how many people still adhere to his doctrine today? The glory of White City is long gone. Your descendants are now killing each other for superficial interests. Compared to that dark age, today's world is nothing. Everyone has a dark side in their hearts. Gretel and I didn't build these kingdoms to make them last forever. What you can foresee, we've foreseen as well. Gretel's face sank slightly. Everyone has a dark side to them. It's just that you've also discovered that there needs to be a centralized country on this land in order to solve some problems. Back then, when you split it into 4, it doesn't seem like a wise choice. Tumen did not show any anger in the face of the Wind Empress rebuke. He only replied softly. If you don't try, there won't be any results, Tumen. Tumen raised his eyebrows and asked, then what was the answer you got? Your soul is still lingering on a ring, lingering bitterly. Why? History has already moved forward. Why are you still standing where you are? Saint Tassol choked and fell silent. Is he the one you chose, Saint Tassol? But Tumen did not seem to intend to continue forcing her. Instead, he turned to look at Brando and asked. Isn't he also the one you chose? The Wind Empress replied snappily. Her angry look made Brando very curious. He had only seen this great sage's confident and strong side. He had never seen her act like a child. Not only that, Saint Tassol quickly recovered and snorted coldly, your old boss, the darkness dragon Odin, and Kelsey also took a fancy to him. This little guy is not simple. Gretel's scepter of fire seems to have decided to choose him as its master. Before the great era comes, heroes are born. This is not strange. Only after experiencing an era can one see the future clearly. Tumen replied. You think too highly of him. The elf's expression was slightly sunken. I don't have as many complicated thoughts as you. I just want to find a successor. Tumen glanced at her and smiled but did not say anything. However, he did not intend to expose her. Instead, he looked at the newly born, thin world of laws behind Brando. Around Brando, the cards of fate that belonged to him floated in the air and formed a circle. Ever since the Knight class was established, the world behind him had stabilized. The cards of fate that were originally scattered around no longer showed any signs of escaping his control. Brando, you reached this step faster than I thought. I thought you would need at least some time to understand the true meaning of power. Tumen could not help but praise after watching for a while. Hearing Tumen's words, Brando could not help but blush no matter how thick-skinned he was. If not for the dear Demoness telling him the true meaning of a planeswalker's power, he would probably still be addicted to power that did not belong to him. Saint Tassol clearly knew the inside story and could not help but snort softly. You flatter me, Lord Tumen. I have only recently understood these principles. Brando sighed. In fact, he really understood the unreliability of power that did not belong to him in the Battle of Ampere Seal. The experience of being pulled into the ultimate realm in the battle with Williams and almost being completely overturned was still vivid in his mind. It seems that you have encountered a lot of things. Tumen smiled gently, but these are not bad things. Whether the results are good or bad, the value of experience is the same for anyone. Moreover, it seems that you did not suffer much in these incidents. This is really just a fluke, Brendel thought to himself sadly. However, these were not his main concerns now. He was most concerned about the issue of the Planeswalker class change. After all, this was related to whether he could activate his elemental powers. He pondered for a moment and asked, "Lord Tumen, are you here to reorganize my cards?" "More or less." Tumen nodded. "You should now understand that the blueprint of the deck I set for you that day was only based on the understanding of your own world. But after all, it is not your own law. If you want to become a true Planeswalker, you must turn what I gave you into knowledge that truly belongs to you. Just like these cards." Brando looked at the White City Vanguard in the deck and said, "Exactly." Tumen praised. "Then what should I do next?" he asked again. "Don't you already have an idea in mind? You just have to follow your own ideas and do it. I am only here to tell you some of the laws that a true Planeswalker must abide by when you become an official Planeswalker." Tumen replied, "As an apprentice, because he uses the power of others, the laws are far looser on him, but he will never be able to reach the ultimate realm. And once you become an official Planeswalker, you will soon understand the true meaning of this inheritance, the true meaning of a Planeswalker." Brando looked up. Just like what Tumen had said, ever since the battle in Ampere Seal, he had thought about his own deck countless times, and now, he had a rough framework. Although it was not to the extent of being detailed to every aspect, it was no problem to create this deck. So Brando nodded and said aloud, "What belongs to a knight, belongs to a knight." As soon as his voice fell, a silver light flashed in midair, and the cards fell one after another. As soon as the sun blade fell, it immediately turned into a silver hymn. In the Amber Sword, hymn was a basic skill of the Fran Knight. This was a special buff skill. It allowed the Fran Knight to sing him on the battlefield to destroy the undead and monsters, and at the same time generate a shield to resist black magic damage on his allies. This brand new card in Brando's eyes looked like this: Him Evernight I Light 2, spell, pay XMP, Knight, lower level, the Fran Knight sings him, dealing X points of damage to non-white creatures, monsters, undead. At the same time, place X counters on each friendly creature, and remove 1 counter for each point of damage from black spells. O glorious holy temple, look at the pure white flames descending from the heavens, covering the army like a pair of wings. Then came the parallel charge, which became the group charge of the Fran Knight. Group charge Evernight Ivy Earth 2, spell, pay 1 glory. The Fran Knight allows his followers to gain the group ability. Maintained, the group charge will be maintained until the reset time of the next day. I saw it with my own eyes. The Sabri people charged with a scream, and an army of tens of thousands collapsed in front of them. Baron Vassar and Caden. Group ability, when creatures with the same ability within a certain range receive a 1% damage bonus. For every additional creature with this ability, the damage will increase by an additional amount. Next was the Golden Battle Flag, Silver Colt, and Holy Sword. They became Encourage, Cavalry Readiness, and Heaven's Armor respectively. Encourage Evernight V-Light 5, spell, pay half MP, Knight. The Fran Knight encourages all allies to level up, current level +5. Maintain, Encourage will be maintained until the reset time of the next day. My glory is your glory, Cavalry Readiness Evernight V Earth 1, spell, pay XMP. The Fran Knight allows X followers to become cavalry. If they are already cavalry, they will receive the ability to fly. Maintain, Cavalry Readiness will be maintained until the reset time of the next day. Banners like the sea, spears piercing through the forest, the knight is ready to go. Heaven's Armor Evernight Vi-Light 4, spell, pay XMP. The Fran Knight summons X number of holy swords from the sky to attack the enemy, dealing 5 points of damage. When the light of judgment plows through the battlefield, the undead army is reduced to ashes, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 694. Whitetown Vanguard, Holy Song, Group Charge, Encourage, Cavalry Readiness, and Heaven's Armor. 6 cards fell into Brando's hand and stacked together. Brando withdrew his hand, and all the cards turned into countless white mysterious runes and lines of law that merged into his chest. Seeing this, Tumen could not help but ask, "Isn't 6 cards too little for a single deck?" Brando smiled confidently, then shook his head. "Interesting, I think I understand what you're thinking." The Elemental Emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints pondered for a moment, then said, "You want to put the abilities of every profession in the world into your deck, combining them into one, and use the cards of fate to simulate completely different power systems. Good idea. But there are many kinds of professions in Wond. Can you use cards to simulate all of them?" Of course, Brando had already considered these questions, and he replied confidently, "Wond has experienced thousands or even tens of thousands of years of history, and thousands of professions have evolved. Even different inheritances of different organizations can evolve into 2 completely different professions. For example, the Wind Elf Star Knight and Steel Scale are both inheritances of the Star Inheritance, but the skills they master are completely different." However, he changed the topic. "The root of the problem is that the power system on the continent of Vaunt can only be divided into 12. Among them, the professions that pursue the limits of battle skills and explore their own potential are divided into 2. Warriors, mercenaries, swordsmen, and even the noble knight can be classified into one of them. Archers and assassins, who pursue lightness and agility, are on the other side of the scale. There are also wizards who explore the mysteries of the law, such as law wizards, flux mages, and charm warlocks. Then there are the rulers of the elements, elementalists. You must be familiar with this profession, Emperor. Next, there are warlocks, witches, necromancers, and followers of chaos who control chaos and dark magic. They are the best of the best. Then there are those who control the balance of nature. Druids and tree herders are mortal enemies, but they are born from this. Then there are Alice and Helene, the beloved of the twin goddesses, those who interpret fate, and astrologers are the representatives of this. Tumen's eyes lit up when he heard Brando's explanation of the professions. It was the first time in 1,000 years that he had heard someone divide the power system of the continent in this way. And the more he listened, the more he felt that Brando's words made sense. Not only the Elemental Emperor, but even Saint All could not help but listen to him. Legend had it that an era ago, before Ebabel Fortress had fallen, and the Grand Library was still well preserved with information from the era of the Divine People, people had indeed divided the power of the world into several systems. But after the disaster, all knowledge, and these precious documents these precious documents were lost their whereabouts. Tumen listened carefully to Brendel's explanation and increasingly felt that this might be the truth. He could not help but narrow his eyes. He did not understand why this young man in front of him could see the essence of power so clearly. Of course, the Elemental Emperor perhaps. What Brando was talking about was actually the introduction to the Amber Sword's power on the official website. If there was anyone who was not clear about this introduction, it would probably be those who had never played the game. Brando continued, however, in addition to the power of nature and the law, as well as the magic of chaos, the law of Tiamat also promises the power of holiness to the world. The secular Hilmer divine system holds the power of creation. The priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the priests of the Holy Cathedral of Wind worship this divine system, so they hold the power of healing. The arrogant Inca divine system controls the sword of destruction. Lightning and holy flames are their authority. The Knight of the Holy Cathedral believes in arbitration and judgment. After that is the power of the mind. The power of the mind is born in the spirit, language, and sound. Bards and psionic warlocks are rare, but they are not legends. In addition, the magical technology that extends from the power of magic has brought alchemists and mechanics. There is also a more special power system. Brando suddenly said. Before Tumen could speak, the Wind Empress could not help but let out a curious sound. But then she seemed to feel a little embarrassed and could not help but snort coldly. Brando had been with this elf lady for a long time. How could he not understand what she was thinking? He quickly explained, "This power system is special, not that it is weak. It should be said that it has existed before, or it only exists in fantasy." "What class?" Saint Tossel finally could not help but say, "Damn you, Brando, don't keep me guessing." "That's because you're too anxious, Lady Wind Empress." Brando was about to say this, but the former glared at him. He could only reply helplessly, "Actually, I don't know, I just heard about it." "Heard about it?" The Wind Empress stared at him suspiciously. "Yes." Brando nodded, but he knew that it was not just hearsay. It was that he could not explain the existence of this class for the time being. The interpreter of the slate, a gift from the era of the gods. A class that players could never touch, in this era, how could he explain it? The elf lady seemed to trust Brando. She looked at him silently and finally nodded. In other words, the power system of the entire wound world is divided into these 12. In fact, it should be 11. Although swordsmen and archers look very different in the army, there is no difference in the nature of their power. Saint Tossel was very knowledgeable, and her words immediately made Tumen nod. Brando also nodded. "You can say that." In short, although there are thousands of classes in the world of wound, but in the end, it is only formed by the intertwining of these 12 power systems. For example, the Rangers of the Ring of Sky and the Ring of Raptors are actually just warriors who master archers and the path of nature at the same time. But time is fair to everyone. Most people who take care of multiple power systems are often not as far as those who pursue one path. Of course, there are a few of them who are outstanding. Brendel explained, "And if I want to perfect my deck, all I need to do is to pick a few classes that I need, and those that are representative of them will be enough. For example, the Knight of Farron, or the Silver Wizard of Buga." After listening, Tumen frowned and thought for a moment, then sighed, "Well said. Although there may be some omissions in the details, it is basically like that. Whether it is the gold or silver folk, or the black iron folk, in fact, they are just operating under these power systems. But even so, have you ever thought that there is another problem?" He looked at Brando and became serious. "Although your deck can include all the power systems and turn them into one, have you ever considered that because of the restrictions of the law of existence on switching decks, in fact, you can only use one or two of them at any time? And the power of a planeswalker is of a higher level than these power systems. Don't you think it is too wasteful to waste it on simulating these low-end power systems? Secondly, because most of your cards are spells, it is easy to be countered. And this is one of the biggest taboos that planeswalkers pursue." Tumen was worthy of being a long-established and experienced planeswalker. With just a little thought, he saw the fatal weakness of Brando's deck, at least in his opinion. Because for any planeswalker, their lifelong pursuit was a perfect cycle of cards. So the more restrained the deck was, the less significance it had in their eyes. The ultimate system was the first lesson that a planeswalker apprentice had to learn. But after hearing Tumen's words, Brando gently shook his head. "No, Lord Tumen, I don't think so. Planeswalkers pursue the ultimate and perfection, but in thousands of years, has anyone succeeded?" This. Tumen was stunned. He could not help but look up at the gloomy sky of the Greyhole Mountains. The history under the sky had been repeated for thousands of years. But history was like a cycle, and no one had ever broken through the final result. Had a planeswalker ever succeeded? Of course not, otherwise, why would they spend their lives searching? Brando smiled. "I have experienced a battle before." He remembered the battle with Williams, and that last thrilling moment would forever be engraved in his heart. He replied, "The experience of this battle made me understand that no matter how perfect the cycle is, it is impossible to face all situations. So, I think that perfection is only a relative state," he said with assurance. "How to achieve a more perfect state in a battle compared to the enemy? Actually, we are all wrong, because the answer is very simple: we just need to become stronger than him. In order to achieve this goal, all power can be borrowed. As long as the advantage is focused on one moment, all tricks will vanish." Tumen looked at Brando. This elemental emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints took a deep breath. "I know a few old friends who have the same idea as you. They pursue extreme violence. As long as the enemy is destroyed, everything is meaningless. But they failed. Do you know why? Because there is always a taller mountain, and there will always be someone stronger than him. The so-called concept of being the strongest is just an ideal." Brando blurted out without thinking. "You know." Tumen was slightly startled and looked at the young man curiously. "Yes." Brando smiled, "But I am different from them. Because I also know that one person can never be stronger than a team." He enunciated each and every word clearly. A single person can never be stronger than a team. After a certain period of time, this sentence was repeatedly mentioned in his memory. That distinct and amiable face, with its hands on its waist and its long black hair draped over its shoulders, also spoke to them word by word. Always remember, one person can never be stronger than a team. This is a game of division of labor and cooperation. I do not welcome individual heroism. Especially you, Sophie." Thinking of this, Brando could not help but smile slightly. But in front of him, Tumen was already deeply frowning. He suddenly thought of something and raised his head in shock. "Wait, that guy Kelsey. Are you thinking of doing this?" Brando looked at the Elemental Emperor's expression and knew that he had completely understood. He nodded and replied, "Yes, Emperor. In fact, before this trip, I had already decided. When I received Sir Kelsey's inheritance, the most precious inheritance I received was not his cards, but his knowledge." Tumen let out a long breath. Planeswalkers each had their own characteristics. But when it came to Kelsey's specialty, it was not his black and white, the endless paradise of adversity. It was the theory he created in the last moments of his life. Planeswalker creatures. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 695. The deer-bodied demoness Helene and the pendulum golem. In fact, their appearance had piqued Brando's curiosity. After the battle in the underground tomb, he finally found out that the summoned creatures of cards could also use cards. Helene had said that she and the pendulum golem had only used Kelsey's cards in a simulated environment. But at least this proved that the great planeswalker must have had similar ideas when he was alive. And this was indeed the case. Kelsey had left behind some records. In his later years, he had this idea, to establish a new law on the creature cards. If a planeswalker could summon all creatures, why couldn't a planeswalker summon other planeswalkers? This was undoubtedly a bold idea that bordered on genius. It was not an exaggeration to say that this idea was bold and imaginative. And the craziest thing was that Kelsey had succeeded. Or rather, he had succeeded in some sense. He first reassembled the deer-bodied demoness and the pendulum golem, two of the strongest cards he had, and the ones he had the deepest feelings for. It could be said that Helene and the pendulum golem were his first experimental subjects. This experimental subject was not perfect, but it gave Kelsey a direction. But it was a pity that this great genius, or rather madman, could not complete his idea. Before he could create a perfect summoned creature, an unknown danger from the underground of Tonajul erupted. He and the Witch Empress chose to use their lives to seal the entire tomb. They also sealed his life's work within it. And this record was eventually passed to Brando by the dear-bodied Demonis. In fact, what Brando obtained was not the complete idea, because even Kelsey did not have the time to perfect it. What was left to him was only a record full of flaws. But this was enough. Just like Brando's idea, it did not need to be perfect, but as long as it could be used to its fullest potential. With the experience of his previous life, it was not impossible for him to create the strongest deck of cards that belonged only to him. You want to summon a planeswalker creature? Tumen looked at him and asked nervously. Brando nodded. Tumen immediately put on a serious expression and asked, but do you know that Kelsey's method is not perfect? After all, a planeswalker has a special authority. He is above all the power systems you mentioned. His method of summoning a planeswalker creature is actually a compromise. I know, Brando replied. Master Kelsey actually shared his authority as a planeswalker so that his summoned creatures would have the same power as his own. There are two problems. First, the sharing of the authority will reduce the limit of the planeswalker's card deck. Second, the summoned creatures will have the same authority as the planeswalker, so they can turn against the planeswalker at any time. Brendel was actually a person who was keen on seeking victory in the midst of danger. He was completely different from those who were cautious and meticulous in their actions. That was why Senpai paid the most attention to him when he was in the Amber Sword. It's the result of a person's idea, was keys. The most important thing is to know your enemy as well as yourself. Therefore, he didn't need Tumen to say anything. He had already investigated all the consequences. Apart from that, he continued, the authority of a planeswalker can't be shared infinitely. With Kelsey's, he can only share 4 additional authorities. With Mai's, I can only have 2 at most. So you understand that. Tumen fell silent. Brando's card deck's capacity was a problem that all planeswalkers had to face. Unlike apprentices who could use other people's card decks without any scruples, every card in a planeswalker's hand was the embodiment of his own law and the construction of the world. Therefore, he had to reserve a certain amount of power for each card to maintain. This relationship was generally proportional to the size of the elemental pool. It was usually 10-to-1, but there was no lack of smaller or larger pools. Tumen thought for a moment and said, Kelsey is almost at the peak of planeswalkers. His power can be said to be on par with mine. Above that would be Lord Odin's level. Since ancient times, there have only been 2 or 3 people at that level. That is to say, even if you consider going down this path, you can only have 4 or 5 planeswalker creatures at most. Also, you have to consider carefully. These planeswalker creatures themselves have a lot of drawbacks. I've thought about it, Lord Tumen. Although I still thank you for your reminder, Brando smiled, I think this is my best choice. Sigh. You. The Elemental Emperor couldn't help but shake his head. He couldn't help but glance at the Saint Soul who had been watching the show coldly and said, This is also your precious student. Aren't you going to persuade him? The Wind Empress spread her hands, this is your planeswalker's business. Besides, I believe in this little guy. Nothing he has done so far has been wrong. Can you believe this? This in itself is a miracle. Tumen was slightly stunned and couldn't help but fall silent for a moment. Then he raised his head and asked, You've thought it through. Then what do you plan to do? Leave it to me, Brando was confident. He had been thinking about this moment since he left the catacombs. After going through the Battle of Ampere Seal, he saw his own thoughts clearly. Moreover, he was hiding a secret that he couldn't tell anyone. He only hoped to verify his conjecture. If it was true, then his path as a planeswalker in the future would be unimaginable. I want to first confirm the core card of the Night deck. First, I need to reshape my elemental pool and card library. Tumen nodded, very good. Unknown laws are dangerous for anyone. It's a good thing to do things steadily. Then I'll watch from here. You can start. Brando nodded and then drew a card from the air. The pattern on the card was so familiar. Under the curtain of stars, a female knight holding a spear and her unicorn were walking through the forest together. This quiet scene seemed to tell a story from 1,000 years ago to the present day. The Medisha in the picture was the same as when they first met in the Eternal Song Forest. Medisha, have you thought it through? Brando asked. This may not be a good thing for you. It may take away your eternal life. The girl's voice smiled slightly, as if it came from the void. My lord, Medisha has already said that it is my honor to be able to follow my lord. Besides, my lord, have you forgotten that Medisha's eternal life is built on your cards? Brando understood. He was slightly moved. Most planeswalkers would more or less consider the backlash of summoning creatures when they gave away their authority. But he was sure that Medisha would never do anything to harm him. He stretched out his hand and pointed at the card. According to the method recorded by Kelsey, he extended his law onto the card. Tumen and Saint Tossol who were present saw that at that moment, the dazzling silver line of law extended from Brando's body and then wrapped around the Unicorn Knight's card. The silver line of law was even more stable than Brando's spatial law. It vibrated slightly in the stone circle. For a moment, the entire spatial law seemed to resonate with it, as if bowing down to this supreme law. However, after a moment, a dark golden card slid out from the wrapping of the line of law and fell into Brando's hand. Fran Knight Eternal Song I Light 30, Creature, Fran Knight, Silver Elf, Level 1, when the Fran Knight enters the field, it has 60 MP ability, Planeswalker. Tap, restores 10 MP maintain, the Fran Knight is a permanent object on the field. Her loyalty is like the straightest sword. She would rather be broken than bent. Planeswalker ability. A summoned creature with the Planeswalker ability can use the cards of fate from its summoner's elemental pool like a real Planeswalker. It can gain experience and use equipment like normal. But once a summoned creature with the Planeswalker ability runs out of MP or life, it will be completely destroyed. Time seemed to flow quietly for a few seconds. Tumen, Brando, and Saint Tossol just looked at the dark golden card. After a long while, the Elemental Emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints could not help but sigh. Although I don't support you doing this, I have to admit that Kelsey is really a genius. In the world of exploring the power of law, I am far inferior to him. This card has already rewritten the history of Planeswalkers. Tumen's eyes revealed an expression as if he was looking at a piece of art. He even looked a little obsessed. But after a while, Tumen could not help but shake his head. But, this kind of law may not be the best for you, Brando. Do you understand? Because you may have to work 1,000 times harder than others. You and I have both forgotten one thing. He continued to add, although they are Planeswalker creatures, the land cards and elemental pools they use are still your own. If you have 4 Planeswalker creatures, then the ratio of land cards in your deck will probably drag down the combat power of your entire deck. The Elemental Emperor raised his head, as if wanting to comfort Brando, but he immediately found that the young man he had always admired was just standing there in a daze. Brando. It was not just Tumen. Even Saint Tossol at the side noticed the abnormality. They saw that a bright flame seemed to light up in Brando's eyes, and a strange smile appeared on his face. Soon, the latter raised his head a little stiffly like a puppet. He glanced at Saint Tossol, then at Tumen, and then said dryly, "You guys better look at this thing." "What?" "My elemental pool." Brando faced Tumen and the Wind Empress and suddenly closed his eyes. His left hand and right hand overlapped, and the power of magic and elemental immediately began to gather in his magic triangle area. In just a moment, the Elemental Emperor's eyes widened. "This is impossible." Won's history was long and complicated. In the long river of history, there were very few people who could be called elemental emperors. Tumen was one of the best. His talent as an elementalist was unprecedented. Later folklore said that when he opened his elemental pool, the astrologers at that time announced the birth of a future elemental emperor. This was because Tumen was probably the only one in Won who had just opened his elemental pool and the capacity of all elements reached 100 slots. However, even Tumen himself had never seen or heard of such a possibility. He had never even considered the possibility of such a thing happening. 2 elemental pools. Brando had 2 elemental pools. At that moment, Tumen and Saint Tassol almost thought that there was something wrong with their eyes. They made an action that was extremely unbefitting of their status at the same time, and subconsciously rubbed their eyes. However, they immediately noticed that the other party was doing the same thing and realized that there was a problem. This was actually true. There was actually someone who had 2 elemental pools at the same time. Tumen looked at Brando, and finally could not maintain his usual calm and composure. He could not help but grab Brando's shoulder. Of course, his subconscious action only allowed his hand to pass through Brando's body like a shadow. This elemental emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints grabbed empty air, and then remembered that he was just an image. But this did not calm his shock. He could not help but ask in astonishment, "Brando, what is going on?" Brando looked at the 2 people in front of him with some surprise. Of course, he knew what was going on. Finally, after a long wait. After officially crossing that invisible barrier and officially becoming a planeswalker, he, as the other half of Sophie's soul, finally had his own elemental pool. And it was far more than just this time. He found that his 2 souls had the same authority in the power system of planeswalkers. What did this mean? Brando almost laughed wildly in his heart. As expected, he had guessed correctly. He could separate 2 times more authority than a normal person. P.S. Today's 3 chapters involve a lot of settings. I spend a lot of time describing them to make the settings seem reasonable. That's why I dragged it out so late, I feel that even writing 30,000 words a day is not so tiring. It's too mentally exhausting. I'm really tired. I hope everyone can support me more. In addition, this is the 9th day, I'll update 10,000 times a day. I'll update another day tomorrow. I've almost made up for the debt from last month, so I may start another chapter tomorrow. Everyone, please support me. Go to hell, the strong baboon, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.